It has been a big question in the minds of gamers for a long time now. What is the best video game franchise? Some are partial to the epic Warcraft franchise, some are infatuated with the long-standing Mario franchise, some are even partial to the indie franchise Five Nights at Freddy's. But to me, there is no better franchise than From Software's magnum opus. Dark Souls is a legendary franchise, and we all know this. It was so successful and influential that it spawned a whole new genre of games people refer to as Souls-likes, but none of these games were able to capture the raw, unbridled brilliance that is these three games, and one of the most iconic aspects of these games, as we all know, is the boss fights. The boss fights of these games are incredible in so many ways, and while there are definitely a few slumps along the way, it can't be denied that the amount of incredible bosses in this franchise is staggering, and today we're going to rank all of them from worst to best, all 92 of them. And yes, this video was a doozy to make, but it was totally worth it. So just a quick disclaimer before we begin, I will be ranking these bosses on a variety of factors and not just the mechanics alone, so things like lore, music, arena, presentation and more will all be factored into the ranking. And also of course this is all just my opinion, so if you disagree don't get mad because that would just be silly. This also won't be including bosses from Demon Souls or any of From Software's other games like Sekiro, because we're focusing solely on Dark Souls for this video. Also, a boss's difficulty can definitely affect its ranking, but the thing about Dark Souls is that it's quite a non-linear series with many choices for how you approach the game that can not only affect the difficulty of certain bosses, but can also affect how they're played in some cases. For example, playing the game with a magic focus build is a much different experience to playing with, say, a shieldless dodge focus build. So to simplify things in this video, we're going to be focusing on the playstyle of a shieldless dodging build, as not only do I feel that's the most common build in Dark Souls, but it's also my favourite, and this is my list after all. In the end this won't make much difference, but I feel it's worth clarifying at least. So without further ado, let's begin this list with the F tier bosses. Bosses that I dread every playthrough and never have fun doing. I'm sure you all were expecting the Bed of Chaos to be at the bottom of the list, and it would be, if not for another. You see, I don't think you understand the soul-sucking awfulness that is the Royal Rat Authority in Dark Souls 2. Every single thing about this boss is bad to some degree. The arena's fine but fairly boring, the boss's design is ugly, the mechanics are minimal, the music barely sticks out at all, and the worst part of it all has to be the start of the fight. You step into the arena and all of these little dogs come charging at you all at once, no matter what you do. Now that doesn't sound so bad, I mean we've seen other bosses where you get gangbanged at the start of the fight, but the thing that makes this extra bad is that these dogs inflict toxic on you, which, if you know Dark Souls 2, toxic is damn near instant death. So if this gets applied, it's basically a death right off the bat, and it's very hard to avoid that when you're having to deal with multiple of these guys all at once and the boss at the same time. And just when you thought it couldn't get any more insulting, the boss straight up rips off Sif the Great Grey Wolf, because when you get it to low health, it starts limping and throwing up. But the thing is, I don't care, because this boss doesn't have a name or a connection to me at all like Sif does, and after the absolute train wreck of a boss fight I just endured, do you really think I'm gonna care? Well, all I can say is you can shove your limping up your ass. The only, and I mean the only, thing about this boss that is in any way redeeming is the fact that it's optional, because this is a boss for the Rat King Covenant after all, so it is completely optional, but all that means is that everyone's just going to skip this boss every playthrough, and they have a good reason to. At least we can only go up from here. Yeah, I kinda spoiled this, but you knew it was coming. The Bed of Chaos is the worst gimmick boss in the whole franchise, to the point where it doesn't even feel like a boss. And it's such a shame as well, because the lore behind the Bed of Chaos is actually pretty good. The The story goes that the Witch of Izalith sought to create a new First Flame using her Lord Soul, and so she created the Chaos Flame, but this flame consumed her and her city, thus transforming her into this horrific tree creature. Cool story, but so utterly wasted on a fight like this. First you go to the right and break a thing while avoiding really lame attacks, and then you go to the left and break another thing. But now you have to deal with scythe attacks, meteor attacks, and of course, everyone's favourite, big ol' holes in the floor that the boss just loves to push you into. I always wear a Ring of Sacrifice on my first attempt on this boss, because getting back to the centre is an absolute nightmare when you have the boss attacking you from behind, so you can't possibly see the attacks coming unless you've got eyes in the back of your head. So after all that, you then have to deal with firestorm attacks on top of everything else, and you have to jump onto platforms at the same time, and we all know how impeccable Dark Souls jumping controls are, don't we? And after all of this, what are you rewarded with? Another jump onto the branch in front of the boss. Yay, more jumping, that's what I play Dark Souls for. And after all of this, what are you presented with? A tiny little insect that dies in one hit. Woo! Yay! An epic battle against the Lord! I'm thoroughly riveted. Okay, with all that out of the way, surely the next one must be better, right? This is not a boss. This is a gauntlet of enemies where you get to kill a big wyvern at the end of it. If there wasn't a health bar on this, then nobody would consider it a boss, because it isn't. I guess the spectacle of killing the wyvern at the end with a plunging attack is pretty awesome, so that's nice, but this still isn't a boss, hence why it's all the way down here on the list. And that just shows the level of quality the Royal Rat Authority and the Bed of Chaos are. They lost to something that barely even belongs on this list. Incredible. Hey kids, let's play a game. It's called Spazzing the Fuck Out. Seriously, the only reason why anyone dies to this fight is because of the first few seconds, where you get completely gangbanged in the smallest space ever with the camera refusing to behave itself. Once you make it past that, it just becomes a stupidly messy fight in the smallest arena ever, with the boss with the smallest health bar ever. If any fight was to ever be described as a clusterfuck, then it would be this one. Please can we have a good boss now? Well, thankfully we're already done with the F tier bosses, so it's time for the D tier bosses. These are merely bad fights, but nothing too offensive. This boss sucks. It's probably the easiest boss in the entire series. All he does is lazily flop around and do very little damage. He has so little health that he'll be dead in just a few seconds, and the fight is loaded with mechanics that just aren't necessary and make no sense. There's one mechanic where you can shoot down these vases from the ceiling, thus freeing these hollows, and he'll go and eat them, allowing you to get in free shots. But not only is this weirdly unnecessary and overly complicated, but it also doesn't help. While he's eating, he takes way less damage than usual, so why would you do any of this to begin with? The only reason I've ever died to this guy is because he's rolled towards me while I was close to a wall, and he just trapped me up against it and I just couldn't escape. So that's fun. Oh, and his lore sucks, by the way. Apparently this guy was a dude who was so in love with Queen Mytha, but she rejected him, so he ate so much that he became this Jabba the Hutt looking creature. So that's an awesome character. The only thing that makes this fight better than the few before it is the fact that it's not painful like them. It's merely just really easy, but at least that's a little bit better. A bunch of rats, and that's it. That's the fight. Seriously, what are these Covenant bosses? This is literally just a bunch of rats, and then out comes a rat with a mohawk, and it dies in 3 hits. This barely feels like a boss, and it sucks hard. The only redeeming thing is that the music is actually alright, and it's not painful like the first few on this list, but it still sucks dick. God, can we just get to the good bosses at any point today? Yay, another boss that's literally just a bunch of dudes in a room and a big dude in the middle. There are no mechanics here, it's literally just a room of enemies posing as a boss. Even the music is just rehashed from a previous boss. I am very much of the camp that Dark Souls 2 is still a really good game, despite not being as good as other From Software games. But in terms of the bosses, it's very clear they went with a quantity over quality approach with the base game's boss roster, and it definitely is one of the major letdowns of the game. Eventually we will get to the good bosses, but until then we have a fair bit more slop to get through. Hey guys, Ava was a cool boss. Why don't we have another fight where there's 2 of him? Genius, good fellow. Seriously, that alone is reason enough why this fight is so low, but it gets so much worse. The run to get to this boss is one of the most painful things I have ever experienced in all of Dark Souls. You have to cross this enormous wasteland of snowy bugger all the while you can't see jack shit, and the whole time you get harassed by these ice reindeer that have some of the most unavoidable attacks in the series. Every time you die to this boss, it means another 6-minute run back across this giant load of nothing, and it takes an absurdly large amount of piss. As for the boss itself, it's not a very well balanced double fight, and the tigers are literally just Ava but black now, so yeah, this boss blows. Thank Christ that this boss is optional, because I never want to do it again. Finally, a boss that isn't from Dark Souls 2, and what was more expected than our old friend Pinwheel. The presentation of this boss is actually pretty good, with a cool arena, a spooky design on the boss, fantastic music that's really unique for the series, and quite interesting lore to boot. The story goes that Pinwheel is a fusion of skeletons of a mother, a father and their child. Together they have stolen Nito's rite of kindling and are using it to study the art of necromancy and rule over the catacombs. So what's the problem with this boss? Well, it's the fact that the boss dies in 3 hits. Not only that, but his mechanics are almost non-existent. It is possible to go and fight this boss from the start of the game, but this is honestly a stupid idea, as the mobs throughout the catacombs are far too dangerous at this stage of the game, even for an experienced player. Even if you do make it to Pinwheel at an early stage of play, the boss still has few mechanics to work with, so it's still a pretty lame boss. As it turns out, a boss cannot exist on presentation alone. However, that presentation is so nice here, and there's nothing offensive about this boss, so yeah, Pinwheel gets a pass from me. The Giant Lord is just the last giant, but with a sword. Literally. That's all I really have to say about this boss. He's incredibly easy, he has barely any mechanics, and isn't all that different from another boss that was already bad to begin with. At the very least, this boss sort of feels like an actual boss, as opposed to everything we've talked about up until now. So congratulations, Giant Lord, you win the award of just about being able to call yourself a real boss. This boss sucks and sucks hard, and I hate it. First of all, the arena is the tiniest thing in the universe. Second, the fucking lava in this place is going to blind me. Third, the boss likes to pin you against a wall so you have like no room to maneuver. Fourth, you have to jump across some lava just to get to an arena that's at least a tiny bit of room. Fifth, the boss has lame ass mechanics and isn't particularly difficult. And sixth, the boss just loves to do this stupid long range attack for about 9 million years before actually getting close enough to be attacked. The only reason it's this high on the list is because of the cool design and the fact that he actually has mechanics, but let it be known that I still dislike him more than someone like Pinwheel. The first boss of Dark Souls 2, and what a lame boss to begin with. The lore of this boss isn't too bad, what with this being the last giant alive after a long war against them, and he's become slender and weak and even has a broken arm. It's decent presentation, but then we get to the fight and we get our first example of Dark Souls 2's quantity over quality approach. All the last giant does is just lazily sweep around the arena and wind up very slow stomp attacks, all of which can be avoided very easily. When he gets low on life, he will rip his arm off and start using that to attack you, which is a cool and sad visual, but it's not really expressed in the music, so it doesn't feel anywhere near as sad as it should be. All around, this boss is just kinda lame really. It was a real indicator to returning fans that this game was going to be a bit rough for boss design. We have returned to the Undead Asylum, and what are we greeted with? The Asylum Demon again, but this time he can be defeated by simply slashing at his ass all day. Seriously, this has to be one of the worst reskin boss fights in the series. His mechanics suck and are very easily avoided, he's incredibly easy to kill by just staying behind him, and he doesn't even look different from the Asylum Demon, so he's barely even a reskin. Even the music is just nicked from the Iron Golem fight, so even that's not original. The only good thing about this fight is how cool it is to return to the Undead Asylum and fight the demon that you saw at the very start of the game. But as a fight, this boss blows. Speaking of reskins, here we have another with the Demon Fire Sage. Somehow this boss has even less new about him than the Stray Demon, because he literally just does all the same things as the Stray Demon, but he is a little bit more mobile now and is also on fire. So this fight is a tad better than the Stray Demon, but somehow it's even more lacking in creativity, and once again is so incredibly easy. That's beneath you, Dark Souls, I know you can do better. This boss probably wins the award for the least amount of mechanics ever. He will slam his arm onto the arena, he will sometimes sweep his arm across the arena, and sometimes he will shoot fire if you get too far away. And that's it. Seriously, I could use my fingers to count those mechanics. Not only this, but the fight is so unbelievably easy yet again, but in some cases it's also straight bullshit, because the big fire attack is practically unavoidable, which leads to many frustrating deaths. At least the boss looks cool and has cool lore, the lore being that this is what the son of the Witch of Izalith became when he was consumed by the chaos, and now he stands guard over the city. Another cool story, but wasted on a bad boss fight. By the way, I'd like to point out that there are 4 bosses in the Demon Ruins route, and yet all 4 of them are in the bottom 15 on this list. What the hell happened here? Another Dark Souls 2 boss, and this one barely even feels like one. It just feels like a big enemy with very few mechanics and easily avoidable attacks. The only interesting part of this fight has to be the arena, which has various sizes that you can choose from, making for a potentially interesting fight. But at the end of the day, this fight just feels so filler, it's unreal. At least he actually has clear mechanics though. Most bosses up until now barely even have that. What's better than 1 Dragon Rider? How about 2 Dragon Riders? But the second one dies in like 4 hits, basically making this just 1 Dragon Rider again. Do I even need to say more? This again is just such a creatively bankrupt fight that it's crazy, and it doesn't help that it's easy as balls as well. The only reason it's higher than 1 Dragon Rider is because the addition of a second one at least makes it slightly more interesting. A giant goat demon waist deep in lava, hitting you with very slow punch attacks and leaving himself open for ages. As Yahtzee Croshaw once said,
"That's beneath you, Dark Souls. That shit's video game shorthand for insert boss fight here."
And it really doesn't help that this boss is so stupidly easy again. This is the first Lord of Dark Souls 2 for most people, and he goes down like a sack of bricks. It's, for lack of a better term, a bit of a letdown. And it's sad because the lore of this guy isn't too bad. An old king that built a giant keep made out of iron that was so heavy that it sunk into the ground, and fire spouted from the earth, melting the keep and causing the king to fuse with the melted metal of his keep and become a god. Once again, a cool story, but it's wasted on a lackluster boss. But I do admit that I do somewhat enjoy this boss, so as a result, he's a bit higher on the list. The Dark Souls equivalent of do the thing 3 times. There's a reason why this style of boss isn't used much in Dark Souls, because it's boring. This boss has like 4 attacks that it will do over and over until it finally lands on the platform, and then you can gain a bunch of attacks and then you repeat. It's got to be one of the most boring and tedious fights in the whole series, and I hate doing it every playthrough. The redeeming things about this boss, however, are its beautiful design, and the music is actually really pleasant to listen to, and again fairly unique for Dark Souls. But all the nice presentation can't save a lackluster fight, as we already know from Pinwheel. This fight is literally just a fight against 3 dudes, and that's it. The only thing that makes this fight interesting is having to use the arena to cleverly kite them around and get in hits, but aside from that, it literally is just a fight against 3 PvP characters. I guess this fight is pretty challenging if you choose to do it alone, but not in a fun way. It's just running around the arena for 20 minutes trying to separate them long enough to get some hits in. Yet another example of these terrible co-op area bosses. Speaking of co-op area bosses, the Blue Smelter Demon. Easily the best of the co-op area bosses, but still just merely a reskin of the Smelter Demon from earlier in the game. But it's blue now. Mechanics wise, this fight is exactly the same as the Smelter Demon, but now the timing of his attacks is much more random, thus demanding patience and reading, which I do like because it's sort of like a hard mode of an already really good boss. But aside from that, this is just the Smelter Demon again, but with a much more painful boss run, so as a result, it can't be any higher on the list. Alright, D tier over with. Time for the C tier bosses. These fights aren't particularly good or bad, they're just kind of average, like, yep, that was a boss fight. The final boss of the original Dark Souls 2, and it's probably the letdowniest of all letdowns. While Nashandra is really cool design wise and has cool build up throughout the game, it doesn't change the fact that her fight is very lacking in mechanics and stupidly easy. Throughout the fight she spawns these curse orbs that of course don't kill you in this game and can mostly be ignored as a result. She'll also swing her scythe in very simple patterns and occasionally shoot a laser and does an explosion, all of which are incredibly easy to avoid. And that's all there is to say about Nashandra really. Just kind of a disappointing boss really to end the game with, and I suppose that matches the general quality of Dark Souls 2 bosses anyway, but let's be honest, that isn't true. There are plenty of really good bosses in the base game of Dark Souls 2, and I really do look forward to getting to them, but unfortunately for Nashandra, she too is one of the game's lamer fights. Another trash mob boss, but this one works a bit differently. First you are greeted by the 3 skeletal lords, and every time you kill one, a bunch of skeletons spawn out of the ground. This fight is not the worst trash boss in the series, but it's definitely lacking in mechanics and isn't all that hard either. The skeletons that spawn throughout the fight are so many in number and do so little damage that sloppy play is almost encouraged, which kinda goes against the whole point of Dark Souls really. But the big redeeming factor of this fight has to be the music. Check this shit out. Overall not the worst fight, but still definitely not what the series is truly capable. Ah, the first boss in the entire series. The boss that introduced us to the franchise and was the first big challenge for us as little newbies. So how good is this fight? Well, the introduction of having to initially run away from the boss is pretty cool, and later when you return with your weapons and do a plunging attack is also pretty cool, and a great introduction to the mechanic. But as for the boss fight itself, well, it's very simple mechanically and severely lacking in challenge, but it is a tutorial boss, so we can kind of forgive it for this. As for the music, it definitely is nice, but it is just rehashed from the next boss, but even then, it's nothing special. So overall, a good introduction to the series, but nothing crazy. But enough nostalgia, it's time to get back to Dark Souls 2 now with the Flexile Sentry. This boss has an interesting design and mechanic where he has two sides, and depending on which side is facing you, will determine what kind of moves he'll use. An interesting idea that makes for a diverse moveset, but that's really all this boss has going for it. The arena kinda sucks, the fight isn't hard at all, his moveset is interesting but still limited, and music wise it doesn't stick out much either. Just kind of an average boss really, but not one I really look forward to each playthrough. I really don't have a lot to say on Mitha the Baneful Queen. Her attack patterns are limited and not very hard to avoid, she has a very small health bar which makes for a pretty quick fight, and her music doesn't really stick out at all. Her design is alright, and her lore isn't too bad either, but neither are great. The addition of the poison around the arena barely affects the fight, and the poison that usually covers the arena can just be cleared away by setting fire to the windmill in the area, which most people do anyway, so that doesn't really matter either. All around this is just a profoundly average boss, and isn't too exciting. A giant spider boss, but is it any good? Well, one thing I can say is that the boss is pretty unique in that you can only attack either of its two heads, and it won't move much throughout the fight. Its attacks are rather lame and a bit bullshit in some ways because some of them are like weirdly difficult to avoid. It also has a big laser, which has to be one of the easiest to avoid attacks in the game, so that's a thing. Yeah, all around I don't really have much to say about this boss either. The arena's decent, the design is okay, the fight isn't offensive or even boring really. It's just an okay fight. But these Lord fights are supposed to be more than that, and so far they've just been a real disappointment. Hey guys, remember Quelaag? She was an awesome boss, so why don't we do her again, but this time with a scorpion instead of a spider. Some sterling creativity on display. This fight has very simple mechanics and isn't very hard, so it doesn't have a lot going for it, but what it does have however is a unique mechanic where she will tunnel underground, and the only way to avoid her attack is to stand on the stone in the area, which is a unique mechanic which definitely spices up the fight a bit, but definitely the best part about this fight is the lore. Najka is the wife of Man-Scorpion Tark, and has become aggressive as time has gone on, so Tark entrusts you with the duty of putting her out of her misery, and he'll even fight alongside you if you wish. A decent fight with fairly good story, but nothing special. The presentation on this one is amazing, but the fight itself kinda sucks. The Demon of Song is a horrific frog creature that imitates the singing of the Milfinito throughout the zone, and when you discover that the singing was coming from this thing and not a Milfinito, it's a pretty cool discovery. The arena of this fight as well is also very beautiful, just like the rest of the zone, but the problem with this fight is that the Demon of Song has like 4 attacks, and all are incredibly easy to avoid, and not only this, but the Demon of Song also has a very small amount of health, and it will most likely die before you even get the chance to see all of its moves. The presentation is the main thing that saves this fight, but otherwise, it's just another lackluster filler fight. The first real boss of Dark Souls, and it's not a super interesting fight. The fight begins with you most likely running back and climbing up the ladder in order to do a plunging attack, which we learned from the Asylum, and from there it becomes a very simple fight in a pretty cramped and narrow arena, which can be quite frustrating to deal with. The Taurus Demon's design is nice, and the arena looks quite nice as well, but the music is just the Asylum Demon's music again, and even though this may be where the music originated from, it's weird that they play it for the Asylum Demon first, and then this boss, so it just kind of feels reused more than anything. At this stage of the game I would expect a bit more originality, but overall a perfectly serviceable boss. the second of the Lords, and while it is a huge improvement over the Bed of Chaos, it's still not a very good fight overall. When you first meet Seath the Scaleless, he can't be damaged thanks to his Primordial Crystal, which we learn about later from Logan, and once we find the Primordial Crystal, Seath rushes to our location to stop us from breaking it, but it's already too late, so now we can fight fair and square. However, the fight itself isn't very good. Seath has slow and easy to avoid breath attacks and swipes, and that's pretty much it. The breath attacks will create crystals that cause curse, which is a unique mechanic for a boss, but it doesn't really improve the fight, and all that's left is his tentacle slams and swipes, which aren't too hard to avoid. But where this fight really shines is the presentation. The arena and design of this boss are excellent, and the lore of Seath as well is really interesting. So the story goes that Seath is an ancient dragon that was born without scales, and he betrayed his own kind to join Gwyn in the war against the dragons. After the war, Gwyn awarded him with Duke status and allowed him to pursue his research in the Duke's archives, but his research and endless pursuit of knowledge drove him mad, and his experiments got more and more out of hand, to the point that he was kidnapping maidens and transforming them into horrific worm creatures. Seath is a fascinating character, and this is the main thing that saves the fight, but it also makes me kinda sad because such an interesting and significant character really did deserve better. At the end of the painted world of Ariamis awaits crossbreed Priscilla, a mutated child of Gwyn that was banished here to watch over its inhabitants. Upon meeting her, she begs you to leave the world, and it's entirely your choice whether you fight her or not, which makes for a pretty emotional and dark fight. Unfortunately, however, the fight itself is incredibly short and very lacking in mechanics. The interesting thing about this fight, however, is the invisibility that Priscilla uses, where you have to look for her footsteps in the snow in order to know where she is. It's an interesting and unique mechanic that definitely spices up what is otherwise a very simple and short fight. The arena for this boss looks amazing, and combined with the Guardian Dragon's tendency to grab onto the side of the cage, it makes for a gorgeous fight. However, mechanic wise this fight is quite a wash. The Guardian Dragon has very easy to avoid stomps and head swipes, and also fire breath attacks that are also pretty easy to avoid, and the music sucks hard. It sounds like the composers weren't even trying with this one. The main thing that saves this fight for me is the stellar aesthetic of the fight, but as a fight, it's certainly lacking. The first real boss from Dark Souls 3, and it's the damp squib of a PvP boss in the Ring City DLC. This boss has pretty cool lore surrounding it, what with the Spear of Church being the guardian of Princess Filianor and all, but the fight itself is rather simplistic and easy. First of all you have to fight against a painting guardian, and then against the titular Spear of the Church, which if you're offline will be a samurai with an actually fairly diverse moveset, and if you're online will be a player from the Spear of the Church Covenant. This makes for a pretty difficult PvP challenge, what with the painting guardians giving the enemy player an edge. But the problem with bosses like this is, of course, hackers, which, while I didn't run into any of them on my first playthrough, did still plague this boss for a while when it came out. And I know this isn't really a problem with the boss itself, it's more the player base's fault, but it is still quite annoying, and if you just do this boss as a PvE fight, then the result is just a pretty simplistic boss. The music is nice, so it has that going for it at least. Overall, a bit of a letdown in an otherwise stellar DLC. Another Dark Souls 3 boss, surprisingly, and it's the easiest boss in the game. High Lord Wolnir has really good presentation, with you first being dropped into a dark cave with hints of something being with you, only to be greeted by the big man himself. Lore-wise, Wolnir isn't too bad either. Long ago, Wolnir was the king of the desert kingdom of Karthus, and was a great conqueror of neighbouring kingdoms. The kingdom of Carthus was likened to an uncontrollable flame due to their destructive power and proficiency in the art of pyromancy. Wolnir even saw the gods as beneath him, and thus stripped 3 holy bracelets and a holy sword from the corpses of clerics, as a testament to his greatness. Driven mad by his own power, Wolnir decided to become the last being alive, and so sentenced his entire empire to death, and would bury them all in the enormous catacombs of Carthus. Using the art of necromancy, Wolnir was able to reanimate his empire and himself, as skeletal beings that he could control as their High Lord, even in death. However, eventually, an abyss would open up, swallowing Wolnir into it, where the only light in the darkness would be the same bracelets and sword that he stripped from the clerics. And so, for the first time in his life, Wolnir began praying to the gods as his only salvation from the dark. An awesome story that actually plays in perfectly to the fight, which I really like. Visually, this boss is beautiful, and mechanically he possesses a unique gimmick with you having to slash away at his bracelets in order to properly damage him. The problem, however, is that these bracelets break way too fast, and his attacks are some of the slowest and easiest to avoid in the entire series. All he does is very slowly swipe around the arena, and occasionally do a big explosion and leak out this mist that does damage. The only real challenge with this fight is making sure you don't run out of room, because if you go behind him then you take constant damage, but every time you break a bracelet he falls back quite a long way, so even that isn't really an issue. I really think this boss could have been a great gimmick boss if it had just been a bit harder, but as it stands, it looks great and it is fun, but it's still way too easy. One of the most unique bosses in the series has to be the Executioner's Chariot. This boss starts off with you in a big ringed room with the chariot racing around the room, damaging everything in its path. The only way to avoid damage is to hide in these little alcoves and make your way to the end of the room to close the gate, thus dismounting the chariot. But the catch is that the whole time you're traversing the room, these skeletons will be harassing you and can't even be killed until you kill their necromancer. And this makes for a surprisingly difficult and stressful first phase. The anxiety I get from seeing the chariot come round the corner is something no other boss really has, and it's pretty awesome. But then the boss dismounts and it just sort of turns into a very simple battle against the 2-headed horse really. The chariot has very simple stomps, charges and breath attacks, and all of these can be easily avoided. Not only this, but once again the chariot has very little health once dismounted, so overall a great and unique first phase, but a very simple and lame second phase. This is one of the coolest boss designs in the whole series, and the music to boot is fantastic. Here, have a listen. So why is the Gaping Dragon so low on the list? Well, it mostly comes down to the fact that the dragon not only has very few and lame mechanics, but it also feels like the biggest sack of health you can imagine. Killing this boss basically consists of bait out the slam attack, bait out the charge attack, attack a bunch, and repeat. And this goes on for ages, and it really lets the boss down, and it's so unfortunate because the presentation is so good. Even the lore is pretty good as well. The story goes that the Gaping Dragon was once a descendant of the original Archdragons, but when the Dark emerged, he began to develop an appetite so extreme that his hunger warped his body, turning his chest into a gigantic maw, leading directly into his bulging stomach. That's raw as hell. Definitely an example of missed potential with this one. A very interesting boss in the first game with fantastic lore surrounding him. Dark Sun Gwendolyn is the son of Gwyn and was born male but raised as a female and became the leader of the Darkmoon Blades. At first when you enter Anor Londo, everything seems nice and sunny. The Sentinels are watching over the city, the Silver Knights guard the keep far and wide, even Guinevere is here. But if you kill Guinevere, then Gwendolyn becomes angry and casts off this petty illusion, and now the true Anor Londo is revealed. The city is dark, there is no sentinels, no silver knights, and no gargoyles. Only the Dark Moon Blades remain, including the Firekeeper, who is now your enemy, as she too was a member. So after fighting through all of that, you make your way into the Tomb of Gwyn, where Gwendolyn himself is waiting for you. The fight begins as the corridor is changed to a seemingly limitless hallway, with Gwendolyn moving back every time you get close. But now after all that fantastic build up and lore, we get to the problem with this fight. Gwendolyn has like 4 attacks, all of which are pretty easy to avoid, and he dies very quickly once you actually reach him. The music of this fight is actually where the Moonlight Butterfly took its music from, and yes, the music is really nice, but this is just like the Taurus Demon again, where we've already heard this music before, so it just kind of feels like a rehash again. This fight really could have been one of the absolute highlights of the game, but as it stands, it's a pretty cool but somewhat disappointing boss. Let's take the Bell Tower Gargoyles from the first game and make them weaker, less interesting to fight, and have 5 of them instead of 2. There's that sterling creativity on display again. Oh, and while we're at it, why don't we just use the same music again as well? Unoriginality aside though, this boss is okay for the most part. There being 3 gargoyles active at once does make for a pretty difficult fight that always feels pretty tense no matter how many times I do it. The individual gargoyles do kind of feel like big regular enemies, but this is okay because there are 5 of them. Overall there's not much to say about this fight other than it's pretty okay and it does a decent job of evoking the challenge of the original Bell Tower Gargoyles where patience is the absolute key. The third Lord of Dark Souls 1 now, and it's a pretty cool one presentation wise. However, the fight is, average. As soon as you enter this fight you take a large amount of fall damage, which is kinda bullshit, especially if you were already low on Estus. After that, Nito will slowly make his way to you while sending his skeletal minions to attack you. While the skeletons don't pose much threat, having to deal with them and Nito at the same time can be pretty intense, especially if you aggro the 3 big skeletons in the back. Nito himself has fairly easily avoidable attacks and not a lot of health, which kinda makes this fight a bit on the easy side, and this is especially the case if you use a divine weapon, because if you do then the skeletons don't get back up and Nito on his own is incredibly weak and easy. This is my main problem with this fight. Yes, the presentation is excellent with Nito's amazing design, great creepy music and spooky boss arena, but the fight itself just feels way too easy and a bit messy really, and it kinda lets it down. Thankfully there's also lore behind Nito which is pretty extensive and pretty great. Nito was one of the original lords who used his lord soul to reanimate himself after death, thus making him the so-called First of the Dead. Using his newly found control over life and death, he was able to aid in the war against the dragons, and afterwards he secluded himself in the Tomb of Giants. However, his story doesn't end there because he was also the one to create the Mil Finito and the Finito in Dark Souls 2, which is some really cool world building. The Finito were created to watch over the dead, and the Mil Finito were created to comfort the dead with their singing. Both parties have little concern for themselves and instead only really care about their sworn duties to the so-called Great Dead One. Definitely a step up from Seath, but still not the great fight that a lord deserves. Another Dark Souls 3 boss, and this time it's our old friend the Crystal Sage. This boss is quite unique in that he mostly uses magic throughout the fight, which makes for a pretty interesting fight, especially in the second phase where he will spawn many clones of himself, all of which will use the same magic that he does. Here you have to sort of use the cover of the arena and choose whether you're going to go for the original indicated by the purple magic, or if you're going to cut down the illusions one by one. It's a unique kind of fight where you basically have to use cover throughout the fight and wait for your opportunity to charge the next target. It definitely is an interesting fight, but still not the best because when the illusions spawn, it can be very easy to get killed by an attack you couldn't see, because you can only see so much at one time. Finally there's the lore behind this guy, or should I say these guys, because there are actually 2 Crystal Sages, the second one of which you encounter in the Grand Archives much later. The story is that these two were scholars obsessed with the Master Sorcerer Big Hat Logan from the first game, and they sought to continue his research and legacy at all costs. Just like Logan, they too mastered the art of crystal magic and developed a cult-like worship with Seath the Scaleless. It's really cool to see Logan's story carried on through these guys. All around this boss is perfectly decent, and I like it. Gwyn 2, only this time he has way less attacks, nowhere near the same amount of challenge, and nowhere near the same level of thematic genius. King Vendrick is a really interesting character lore-wise, but once again a boss's great story is wasted on a lackluster fight. King Vendrick is the king of Tran Lake, and sought to find a cure for the undead cursed, and sacrificed much to find it. But in the end his search was fruitless, and he became saddened and secluded in the depths of the undead crypt, until finally he turned hollow. When you find him, he is but a hollow shell aimlessly wandering around the arena while a sombre piano plays in the background. It's a very good bit of story and very sad, but the fight itself doesn't feel like it does this character justice. Yes, I know he's a withered hollow and a shell of his former self, but Gwyn was the same and he could still fight. There was still a trace of his mighty old self, but with Vendrick all he can do is just lazily swing around his sword while doing quite frankly ridiculously high damage that feels a bit too punishing at times. The fight is nicely challenging and his mechanics are well defined though, so he's definitely a lot better than a lot of the bosses below him. All in all a strong boss narratively and presentation wise, but a bit lacking mechanic wise. The third of the Lords of Dark Souls 2, and it's one of the most average bosses in the franchise. The Lost Sinner is definitely not a bad boss, the mechanics are solid, the arena is interesting, and the boss's design is pretty good, but there's not much here to really separate this boss from others, which is quite disappointing, especially considering that this is a Lord. Bosses like this should be the highlights of the game, but unfortunately once again the Lords disappoint. The Lost Sinner does have a unique feature however with the arena's lighting. If you enter the arena normally, then the room will be really dark and it becomes hard to see and target the boss, which adds a surprising amount of challenge to the fight. However, you can circumvent this by igniting the oil in the nearby rooms before the fight, which is an interesting concept we never really see again. The fight itself does have some clearly defined attacks and some decent challenge, and it's definitely not a bad fight. I do like the Lost Sinner's lore as well. In the original Japanese version, the Lost Sinner is actually referred to as the Forgotten Sinner, because it's implied that she's been imprisoned for so long that she's long since been forgotten about. As to why she's imprisoned, well, interestingly, nobody actually knows. All we know is that once upon a time she tried to link the First Flame, but failed, and she committed sins so heinous that she imprisoned herself forever in complete agony. It's unknown whether her attempt at linking the fire was to make up for her sins, or if her failure was her sin. It's also implied that she has some connection to the Witch of Islip, but that's never elaborated on, and I really like all this mystery surrounding her. Overall a perfectly decent boss, but nothing about it really stands out. The other boss from Dark Souls 3's DLC now, and it's a better one than the last thankfully. The Champion's Gravetender starts out with a simple battle against the dude, but it quickly turns up the heat when the alpha wolf that you've encountered throughout the zone joins the fight. The Gravetender is pretty standard, but the wolf is an actually pretty decent boss fight with solid mechanics and a fair amount of challenge to boot. Not to mention the arena is beautiful, even the music is actually pretty good to be honest. The lore of these guys isn't extensive, but it too is pretty decent. Long ago an undead tournament was started, where undead would battle it out to the death over and over again as a glorious use of their immortality. The champion of this tournament eventually went hollow and died for good, but his protege continued to protect his grave along with his trusted wolf companion. The unfortunate thing is that there's not much else to really say about this boss, and therefore it's down here on the list, but still an improvement over the Spear of the Church. This boss's design is awesome and terrifying, a giant mass of hollows that has become one being at the bottom of a giant trash pit. It's a striking and terrifying design, but unfortunately the fight itself is once again nothing special, so I guess this is the best the Lord fights of Dark Souls 2 can offer, an average boss. That's just kinda sad. Mechanically this boss isn't too special, with simple swipes, simple explosions and simple grabs, all of which are not too difficult to avoid. The arena is nice and the music has a unique creepy tone to it, but nothing here really sticks out aside from the boss's design. That being said, there is a unique attribute to the arena here where the oil around the arena is on fire, so stepping in it will do damage, and this makes for fairly treacherous terrain. This does add some spice to the fight, but not enough to really elevate it. Lore-wise there isn't much going on here either, although it is implied that the shards of Gravelord Nito's soul is what brought the Rotten together. However, that's all we really know. Unfortunately in the end, none of the Lords of Dark Souls 2 really impress. Alright, time for the B tier bosses. These are the good fights, fights that I look forward to each playthrough and remember fondly, but they still aren't quite peak Dark Souls for me. The second boss of Dark Souls 3, and a pretty good one at that. Vault of the Boreal Valley has an interesting backstory behind him as well as a cool design that already gives this boss a thumbs up. Vault was the largest and strongest knight of Irithyll, but was morphed into a huge dog-like creature thanks to the magic of Pontiff Sullivan, with the purpose of ensuring that he could never betray his new master. A fascinating story to complement a pretty decent fight. His attacks feature a range of fast attacks and delayed attacks, and when he enters his second phase, his attacks become frantic and crazy, with him charging all over the arena. It can be pretty challenging for new players and definitely is a good way to open up the world of Dark Souls 3. I do think that this fight can be a little messy in the second phase when he starts charging around like a madman, but this doesn't really affect the fight negatively. Another cool aspect of Vault is that he will employ freezing attacks throughout the fight, which I believe makes him the first enemy in the game to do so, which is a nice way of introducing the mechanic. Definitely a nice early game boss. The first triple boss of the series, and a good one at that. The Ruined Sentinels begin with you on a small platform fighting against one of them. Once this first one is down, the other two will make their way over to you, causing you to have to drop down to the floor below to begin a double fight. And as a double fight, the Ruined Sentinels are actually pretty good, with a wide range of moves and a good amount of challenge to boot. Their attacks feature a nice amount of delays as well, which is always nice, on top of some sick shield throws and somersault slams. I also quite like their music, and clearly the devs did as well, because they reused this track multiple times for other bosses, like the Smelter Demon for example. The only complaint I really have is the whirlwind attacks they like to use, because it seems just a tad unavoidable since they move so fast while doing it. But aside from that, this is a pretty decent multi-boss that I definitely enjoy each playthrough. The final Lord of Dark Souls 1, and it's easily the best one of the bunch. The Four Kings begin with you in a dark void with seemingly nothing in it, but then the Four Kings begin to appear and the fight begins with some actually pretty good music to boot. Mechanically the fight is not the best, with some pretty unavoidable magic and some even more unavoidable grabs, but where this fight really shines is when more of the Four Kings appear. Only one will engage in close combat at any given time, and the others will kind of poke at you from behind, which makes for a pretty stressful DPS race that I quite enjoy. This can somewhat be cheesed if you have strong weapons, but the coolest thing is, the Four Kings can be fought before you even travel to Anor Londo, unlike the other lords, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that this was the most fun way to fight them, as the DPS check is much tighter at this stage, and it can be easy to get overwhelmed if you're not constantly alert. The lore of these guys is easily one of the best parts though. The Four Kings of New Londo ruled over the city with fragments of a lord so entrusted to them, but when the Dark Wraiths were released, they too were taken by the Abyss and transformed into these horrible creatures, and so the whole city was flooded to seal the dark away, and the catastrophic effects of that are clear throughout the zone. It's a harrowing story that really shows how relentless Gwyn was in his pursuit of containing the dark, and it is definitely not wasted on this boss. Finally, a Lord boss fight gets it right. After traversing the fortress of traps that is Sen's fortress, you are greeted with the Iron Golem at the top, and what a nice boss it is. This boss has nice, simple and well-defined mechanics that pose a decent amount of challenge throughout the fight. If you hit the golem enough in the leg, then he will start to stagger for a while, and if you hit him some more, then he will actually fall over, allowing you to get in loads of attacks. And this does kinda make the fight a bit on the easy side, but it's still an interesting mechanic. The music to this fight also is pretty good, and the constant risk of being knocked off the edge adds an extra layer of spicy challenge to the fight. This fight is a bit on the simple side, but still is a nice and well balanced one that definitely feels like a satisfying end to one of the better zones in the series. The first double boss in the series, and the first big wall for most players, the Bell Gargoyles are a very nice introduction to the concept of double bosses. The fight starts out simple enough with a single gargoyle with a diverse moveset, but the fight goes up to 11 once a second one joins the picture halfway through. Only one will attack in melee at a time, and the other will use a flame breath attack mostly, which makes it difficult to get in close to them to get in attacks. It's a surprisingly well balanced fight that poses a great deal of challenge and really teaches new players the value of patience and waiting for your opportunity to strike, as well as clever positioning. Add in the constant risk of falling off the roof and the limited space available to you, and you have a very nice boss that makes a great first wall for new players. After the disappointment that was the last giant, Dark Souls 2 busts out a much better boss with the Pursuer. This boss has a very cool design and really cool story where he will literally pursue you throughout the game for unknown reasons, and every time he appears I get very excited because I love fighting this guy. His mechanics are simple, but very well balanced and defined, and he poses a nice amount of challenge throughout the fight. Not to mention the arena in which you fight him is beautiful, with the ocean and sunset in the background. The only issue I really have with him is that his moveset is a bit too limited, and he's incredibly easy to avoid by just moving to the right. If these issues were fixed, then this could have truly been a great boss, but as it stands, he is still a much needed good boss in this game of pretty mediocre boss design. Continuing on the streak for Dark Souls 2 is the Old Dragon Slayer, everyone's favourite Ornstein cosplayer. This boss has all of the same moves as Ornstein from the first game, plus a few extra dark magic attacks, and makes for a pretty good 1v1 fight with a decent amount of challenge. Not to mention the music to this fight is excellent. Here, have a listen. The complaints with this fight start with the fact that without Smo here, Ornstein on his own is not as interesting a fight, but this is admittedly a small complaint, because the fight is still pretty decent even without the big guy around. Is it exceptional? No, but is it good? Absolutely. Once again, a very welcome boss among the particularly weak lineup of Dark Souls 2. This is what the Prowling Mages and Congregation should have been. The Deacons of the Deep is probably the best trash mob boss in the series, because it actually has challenge and mechanics, and isn't just a room full of dudes. In this fight, every time you kill a Deacon, more will spawn from the centre. So the only way to actually damage the boss is to kill whichever one is glowing red until the second phase where the Archdeacon will spawn and become the singular target. There's a surprising amount of mechanics in this fight, from the room filling with curse to the large orb of death to the Deacons even having a habit of using force on you. It can actually be quite a lot to deal with and makes for a pretty good amount of challenge. In some cases the fight can even be a test of your weapon's durability with how much you have to kill in this fight. Oh, and have you heard the music to this fight? Definitely the best example of a trash mob boss in the series. And yes, I know I haven't said anything about the lore on this boss, but quite frankly I can't do that without talking about the next boss on this list. Speaking of, The first of the Lords of Cinder in Dark Souls 3 is Aldrich the Devourer of Gods. This fight is not the best mechanically because while Aldrich has some interesting attacks like the Rain of Arrows, most of his attacks just feel like lazily flailing all over the place, and it doesn't really have the refinement that most other bosses in this game have. But where this boss shines is the presentation and the lore. Going back to Anor Londo after so long, and it being so dark and ruined, is a really cool bit of nostalgia, and fitting for the story because Aldrich is literally the devourer of gods. Even the music to this fight is fittingly nostalgic as a sort of intense remix of Gwyndolin's old theme. It may not be the best fight mechanically, but it more than makes up for it in the presentation and lore, and speaking of which, let me tell you the tale of Aldrich the Devourer of Gods. Aldrich was a cleric of the Way of White, serving the gods in the Age of Fire. However, in reality, he was a sick and depraved individual who loved nothing more than consuming human flesh and hearing their pained screams. He loved this so much that his soul became drenched in dark, and his body morphed into a massive sludge-like substance. Soon he was exiled by Pontiff Sullivan to the Cathedral of the Deep, which wasn't called that at the time, where he would hopefully be purified by its holy waters, but instead he only continued his depravity and grew in power more and more to the point of him being worthy of linking the fire. His influence grew to the point that the deacons of the church were providing him a constant stream of human sacrifices, which even included children, some of which were even Aldrich's own. Eventually he was able to link the fire and was entombed in the cathedral afterwards, but despite this, he continued his depravity to the point that his soul tapped into a new level of dark called the Deep. The holy water of the church became corrupted and started to produce horrific creatures from its dark mass, and so the deacons of the church made it their duty to keep the Deep sealed away within the cathedral. Eventually, Archdeacon MacDonald was sent to aid the deacons and taught them the ways of sorcery to better combat the horrors of the Deep. However, as time went on, the deacons too became corrupted by the Deep, and they began to worship it and its saint, Aldrich the Saint of the Deep. When Aldrich rose from his tomb again, he no longer was interested in linking the fire, but now only sought to destroy the gods and usher in the Age of the Deep Sea. And so, he and his deacons returned to Irithyll, seeking to consume the body of Gwendolyn and snuff out the fire forever. And so when we finally begin our journey, the deacons had become dark worshipping cultists with blue robes, and Aldrich had successfully consumed Gwendolyn's body, thus gaining his power and his appearance. This has got to be one of the longest stories for any boss in the series, and I fucking love it. Such an interesting tale that really shows that Dark Souls 3 is second to none in its world building and characters. Finally, a Dark Souls 2 boss that isn't a crappy co-op area boss, and a very nice one at that. Ilana the Squalid Queen is very unique as bosses go in that she will mostly use magic throughout the fight, similar to the Crystal Sage, but the really unique thing about her is that she will summon bloody Velstad to aid her, sort of making this a double fight in a way. It's a great addition that makes for a challenging and interesting fight. Presentation on this fight is also great, with you descending the Dragon Sanctum following the haunting singing emanating from below, and once you get down there, you're met with Ilana in front of this beautiful carving on the wall, making for a lovely arena for the fight. Ilana doesn't have much in the way of story, but she has a bit. Ilana is one of the fragments of Manus, Father of the Abyss, another one of which was Nashandra, and she was the queen of the Sunken King, but when her city of Shulva was destroyed, she teamed up with Sin the Slumbering Dragon, seeking vengeance for the city. A decent story, but we've definitely heard better. The only real complaint I can think of regarding this fight is that Elena herself doesn't really have a lot of mechanics, and this fight mostly works because of Velstad, but still it's a strong boss that shows the DLC of Dark Souls 2 is definitely stepping the bosses up a notch, and trust me, we're only just getting started with these bad boys. Speaking of DLC bosses, the first Dark Souls 1 DLC boss at last, and you could clearly see that From Software was stepping up the boss design with these ones. The Sanctuary Guardian has an incredible design, being a sort of angel manticore thing created by the sorcerers of Ulasil, and it also has a diverse and well balanced moveset to boot. Attacks like lightning blast, aggressive swipe attacks, diving attacks and more. It's a pretty exciting boss with a not insignificant amount of challenge to it. It probably is a bit on the easy side, but not to the point that it feels like a joke. It's still a very fun time every time I do it. A nice opening to the Artorias of the Abyss DLC that was only just getting started with its lineup of killer bosses. The old Demon King is a very pretty boss to sit through, but mechanically is a bit clunky. His moveset is good, but a little buggy due to his weapon being so large. One time in a previous playthrough I literally clipped inside his weapon somehow, and this caused me to lose the attempt, and this is definitely the biggest problem with this fight. It's not just the clipping, but it's also the camera issues as well, caused by his weapon getting in the way. Otherwise this fight is a banger. The mechanics are interesting and varied, with many unique moves like his Meteor Rain and his Rings of Fire. The arena is also gorgeous, with mountains of demon corpses piled all around it, and the boss design is pretty keyno as well. The fight even has a really cool moment towards the end, which actually plays into its lore. The old Demon King is said to be one of the last living demons alive after the Bed of Chaos was destroyed in the first game, and at the end of the fight the old Demon King will unleash a huge explosion of fire, thus draining him of all of his power so now he can barely lift his weapon. This could be an implication that the embers of the Chaos Flame within the Demon King was the only thing keeping him alive, but now drained of his flame we see him for the truly withered old being that he is. It's a cool ending to a hot fight that, with just a bit of refinement on the buggy aspects, could have easily made it into A tier. And yes, it is that time. We're at the A tier bosses now, and this is where things really start getting good. These fights are the highlights of their games, and I have a great time doing them each and every playthrough. So, let's get started. The second Lord of Cinder now with Yorm the Giant, and a brilliant showcase of lore and spectacle. Yorm was a strong king who conquered many civilizations and took the people under his noble protection, eventually befriending Siegfried of Katarina. One day the four female relatives of an unnamed oracle triggered a curse that warped their bodies into horrific monstrosities of sin and created the profaned flame. The flame destroyed the profaned capital, all the human inhabitants were killed, and Yorm became saddened and reclusive. To put the flame to rest, Yorm became a Lord of Cinder, leaving only the flame in Pontiff Sullivan's hands remaining. When Yorm was raised from his grave as a Lord of Cinder, he refused to take up his throne once more, and so you and Siegfried arrived to face him and bring him back to his throne together, as Siegfried made a promise to Yorm that he would put him down if anything like this happened to him. It's a strong and emotional story that really elevates this fight. Mechanic-wise this fight is pretty interesting. Yorm can only really be damaged by using the Storm Ruler weapon's special attack, which makes for an interesting and unique fight that I really enjoy. The music as well is fantastic as ever, and so is the arena. The problem with this fight however has to be the fact that Yorm's attacks are surprisingly weak and easy to avoid, which kinda makes this fight a bit of a letdown in the challenge department, especially if you bring Siegfried along, which I highly recommend you do by the way. But aside from the difficulty, this is an excellent boss, and one I very much look forward to with each playthrough. Dark Souls 3 is really the only game in the series to actually do the Lord fights justice, and we aren't even close to the best ones yet. Why couldn't you be like this 1 and 2? Holy shit, this is an enormous improvement over Nashandra. Aldia, Scholar of the First Sin, has some of the best presentation and lore in all of Dark Souls, and I don't say that lightly. You first encounter Aldia after acquiring the final Great Soul, in which he commends you for coming this far, and hints at there being two paths at the end of the journey. After this, Oldia will occasionally appear at other points in the story, conversing with the player about what it is they seek. And then, after Nashandra will finally appear and give the chosen undead their final challenge. It's tremendously good build-up of a character with fascinating backstory. Oldia is the elder brother of Vendrick, who sought to learn of the nature of the undead curse, as opposed to Vendrick who wished to cure it. He committed countless horrible experiments in his keep, all with the purpose of shedding the yoke of fate, only to become a horrific monstrosity himself. The questions and challenges he asks the player are incredibly interesting, and I'm glued to my screen every time he appears. But enough of all that, how's the fight? Well, the music slaps for one thing. But the mechanics are, well, not the best. Oldia does have a unique gimmick in that he doesn't move and you can only damage him when his flame wall drops, but his attacks are pretty limited and not particularly hard to avoid, which is really disappointing because the lore and presentation of this fight is so damn good. It's a massive example of wasted potential because this could have been one of the best damn bosses in the series, but as it stands, fantastic presentation, shame about the fight. On the other end of the scale, before Oldia no less, is the Phone Guardians, a boss with very little presentation or lore-wise, but pretty key-known mechanics. The Phone Guardians are a double boss of a sort of Ornstein and Smough vibe, where one is larger and slow and the other is smaller and faster, and it makes for a pretty good double fight. The interesting part, however, is that you can't kill them separately, you have to kill them within a short time of each other, lest they resurrect the other with full health. This is a unique mechanic that definitely gives the fight a bit of spice, along with the fact that they can switch from sword and shield to two-handed, and even enchant their weapon, giving them quite a bit of variance in their movesets. Overall a nice fight from the ending trio that only really falls flat with Nashandra in the end. Good thing Dark Souls 2 was able to get the ending it deserved in Scholar of the First Sin. The first boss of Dark Souls 3, and a very nice one at that. I won't talk about the lore here because it's more appropriate that I do that for a later boss, so instead we'll just focus on the fight instead here. Iudex Gundyr has a very diverse and well balanced moveset that I never get tired of. His attacks range from quick to delayed, and even has follow-ups on his attacks like his patented elbow slam. It's pretty exhilarating for a tutorial boss, but I most definitely am not complaining. The problem with this fight though is the second phase. While it is an incredible spectacle seeing the giant pus of man burst out of his body, the carefully constructed mechanics of the first phase sort of disappear in this second phase, and his moves become a bit more on the messy side. It's kind of hard to even tell what's happening at times because he's so damn large and it's hard to tell what can even hit you. But this second phase doesn't stop this fight from being a very strong opening to arguably the best game in the series. Probably going to be my most controversial pick on this list, but fuck it, it's my list and I'm rating based on what I feel, and I feel that the Ancient Dragon is a banger. The design of this guy is awesome, he truly feels like a proper ancient dragon with his enormous size, and the arena is one of the most beautiful in the franchise. As for the fight itself, well, the Ancient Dragon does admittedly have a limited moveset of very slow and overtly punishing attacks, but the thing that really makes this fight work for me is the difficulty of keeping him away from the edge of the arena and systematically running to his tail whenever he does his flame breath. It's a weirdly strategic fight in spite of his limited moveset, and I enjoy it a lot every time I do it. Maybe not for everyone, but definitely a good fight in my eyes. Lore-wise, the Ancient Dragon is a bit of a mystery, and it's really unclear what exactly this creature is. On the outset, it looks like an authentic Ancient Dragon, but multiple characters in the game refer to it as a false god. And this is brought even more into the question with the fact that it doesn't even drop a soul of an ancient dragon upon death, but instead it drops the soul of a giant. The actual soul of an ancient dragon is found in a memory later, using the Ashen Mist Heart, implying that the real thing died long ago. There are rumours that Aldia was attempting to make his own dragons, but it's unknown if he was successful, so maybe this was the result of his experiments? Who knows? While we're at it, here's another controversial pick with the curse-rotted Greatwood, which, quite frankly, is my favourite gimmick boss in the series. In order to damage this guy, you need to burst these pustule things scattered around his body, and I find this weirdly satisfying for some reason. All the while you need to avoid his rather slow attacks, which isn't too hard, but the challenge really comes about in the second phase, when a giant arm will sprout from his chest, thus adding extra complexity to his attacks. This arm can also be attacked for good damage, which makes it a bit of a weak point as well. On my first playthrough, I was here for a solid hour, dying over and over on this boss, but never once did I really get mad, because it was just so much fun. I think it's a really strong gimmick boss with a cool design and arena. The only real complaint I have is the first phase, where all these ads will constantly spawn and harass you. It just gets a bit annoying, but aside from that, I thoroughly enjoy this boss each playthrough. The boss that Ludenzalen ripped off, Ava the King's Pet. This boss has a sick design and a cool introduction to boot. The first time you enter the arena, you are warned of Ava's presence when a fight starts, but there's nothing around you. But suddenly you're being attacked, and it's clear that you can't see Ava yet, and so you explore around the zone to find a way of revealing him. Once you do so, the real fight can begin. Ava isn't too unique in terms of beast bosses, but he is well balanced and has some cool moves to boot, so this can mostly be forgiven. The thing that really makes this fight is the presentation, and on that front this fight is a banger. Not much else to really say, but that's okay. A strong stamp of approval from me. A really good boss in the main game of Dark Souls 2 is rare, but here it is with the Looking Glass Knight. The arena of this boss is amazing, with the thunderstorm raging around you, which actually gets incorporated into the fight as well with his lightning attacks, which makes for an awesome visual. Mechanically this boss is pretty strong, but not the best. But the best part of this fight absolutely has to be when he spawns a phantom out of his mirror. This can either be a regular NPC invader, or even a player, which can make for a really cool fight, assuming they're not hacking of course. Unfortunately I've never been able to experience this, but hopefully one day I will, because it sounds like a blast. His story is rather simple, but still nice. The Looking Glass Knight was once a lieutenant of Vendrick and tested new warriors before they were allowed to serve in the king's army. Ever since Vendrick's disappearance, the knight has remained at the back of Drangleic Castle to ensure that no one can disturb the king. A nice boss to break up the abundant mediocrity that is Dark Souls 2's boss lineup. Probably the most vocal boss in the entire franchise is Osiris the Consumed King. This boss is pretty awesome. The fight starts out simple enough with pretty standard mechanics, but quickly turns up to 11 when the second phase starts and Osiris yells, Once this phase starts, he will, for lack of a better term, spaz the fuck out all over the arena, making for one of the most frantic fights in the whole franchise, and it's a pretty intense challenge. Not to mention, in typical Dark Souls 3 fashion, the music slaps hard. The only problem with this fight is that it's maybe a bit too messy. I wasn't lying when I said that this boss literally spazzes the fuck out during the second phase, and mangling the dodge button is all you really can do. Still a very nice boss and one I love to quote all the time, but without a doubt, the best part about Osiris is the lore behind him and the mysterious invisible child he appears to be cradling. Once upon a time, Osiris was the king of Lothric before it was even called Lothric, and he was married to Guinevere, the Queen of Sunlight. Yes, that Guinevere. and together they upheld the kingdom's tradition of linking the fire and producing worthy champions to continue linking it. One day the younger prince named Lothric was born, and he was destined to be the next Lord of Cinder. The kingdom was even renamed after him in his honour. Unfortunately, Lothric was born a sickly and weak child, and was unable to fulfill his destiny, causing Osiris to begin his descent. Osiris kept searching for a worthy champion, but repeatedly failed, until he began his fascination with the legendary Sif the Scaleless. His fascination led to an obsession with Sif, as he believed that if he could become a dragon, then he could conceive a child of dragons, which would finally be the heir that he was looking for. His obsession devolved into insanity, and he began to believe himself to be a dragon, and started researching ways to transform himself into one. Eventually his research transformed him into an abomination, without scales, without eyes, and without wings, but still, it was good enough for him. Finally, Ocelot was conceived and born, an invisible child of dragons destined to become the kingdom's saviour at last. Throughout the fight you can actually hear a child wailing, implying that Ocelot is indeed real and not a delusion of Osiris. However, since Osiris can't see him, he begins to descend further into madness throughout the fight, until finally he executes his own baby child and devolves into complete and utter madness in the second phase. This is legit one of the best stories for a boss I've seen in all of Dark Souls, and it really elevates this fight even higher than it already was. Fantastic stuff. What would a mermaid look like if you replaced the bottom half with a giant hell spider? The answer is Chaos Witch Quelaag, and what a boss she is. Not only is Quelaag strong mechanically, but she is an interesting character with a tragic backstory. Quelaag was one of the daughters of Chaos who had her lower half warped by the Chaos Flame when escaping from Izalith, along with her sister, who now is sickly and weak after having swallowed the Great Blight Pus. Even though Quelaag disagreed with her decision, she still stuck with her and vowed to protect her from any potential harm, and this is why she attacks you when you first meet her. It's a tear-jerking story that makes me feel so awful every time I have to kill her. As for the fight itself, the music is strong, the arena is decent, and her attacks are well balanced and fun to fight against. The only complaint I have is that her attacks are a bit too limited and a bit on the easy side, but this is a small complaint on an emotional powerhouse of a fight. The first really good non-DLC fight you encounter in Dark Souls 2, at last, with the Smelter Demon. This boss is incredibly fun and balanced, and poses a great challenge that has killed me many times over. His moveset can be a bit limited, but it's not too much of a problem because it's so much fun and I'd rather have a small good moveset than a large crap one. The interesting thing about this fight has to be the fact that as the fight progresses, the Smelter Demon will ignite both himself and his weapon, effectively making this one of the first 3-stage boss fights in the series. Fancy that. There's little to no lore on this guy unfortunately, but it is implied that he's the one who killed the original Iron King. All in all, a very welcome boss that finally showed us that Dark Souls 2 is capable of good boss design. Probably one of the most hypnotic bosses in the series is the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. The music on this boss is truly magnificent and just wows me every time I hear it. Her moveset as well complements this, with it being one of the most interesting fighting styles in the series. Unlike most other bosses, the Dancer will slowly circle the player, even basically letting the player attack her, only to pounce with her incredibly graceful and sleek attacks that can be a real challenge to read because of how unorthodox they can be. This is especially the case in the second phase, where the Dancer will pull out a second weapon and begin doing all kinds of combos. It's a uniquely challenging boss with some of the most mesmerising presentation in the series, and I truly have to sing its praises because of that. And now we've made it to the S tier bosses. bosses that truly knock it out of the park and are the defining moments of their games. So, let's get started, shall we? Speaking of the Boreal Valley, it's time for Pontiff Sullivan. This is one of the hardest bosses in the franchise, and every playthrough he kills me about 5 times at least. But the thing is, this boss is totally fair and very fun. He's one of the most aggressive bosses in the series, with almost constant attacks that can really only be predicted rather than reacted to because of their ridiculous speed. The amount of mix-ups he can whip out throughout the fight is crazy, but memorizing them and reacting accordingly is very fun and challenging. Things get even more intense in the second phase, however, where he will grow wings and periodically spawn a clone of himself that will do everything that he does, but a bit later. And if you thought things were hard before, then you haven't seen anything yet. This is all amazing, but we haven't even talked about the presentation or lore yet. The fight opens up with a slow approach in Sullivan's Cathedral, which is a beautiful introduction to this fight. And not only this, but his 2 different blades, one of magic and one of fire, make for an amazing design that looks beautiful in action. And now it's time for the lore. Sullivan is an incredibly in-depth character with a long history, so I'll try and shorten it as much as possible. So here we go. Pontiff Sullivan was born and raised in the painted world of Ariandel, but grew unsatisfied with the world as he wasn't banished there like other inhabitants. Eventually he left the painted world and came to Irithyll, a city established by Gwyndolin and Guinevere as a home for both gods and humans, and even god-human hybrids. Sullivan was accepted into the city, and after some time unearthed the profaned capital and a treasure that would define his life going forward, the profaned flame, a dark flame ever burning, unique in a world constantly starved of fire. With this flame he began a long plan of manipulating the people and climbing up the political ladder so he could usurp Gwyndolin and rule over the city, and one day, when his flame was the only one left, the entire kingdom. When Gwyndolin became sickly, he planned for his sister Emma to become the new leader of Irithyll, but Sullivan had other plans. He imprisoned all the remaining Darkmoon Blades and used twisted dark sorcery to control and warp the knights that served him. He even took the greatest knights of the city, including Vort and the Dancer themselves, and used this same magic on them that would warp their bodies into beast-like creatures so that they could never rebel against him. The beasts that you encounter at the entrance of the city and in the flooded basement are the final form of this warping, and it's also in the flooded basement that we find the corpse of Archdeacon MacDonald at last, showing that he too met his end when Aldrich invaded the city. The lore of some of these characters in Dark Souls 3 is truly staggering in its depth, and it makes already amazing bosses even better. A very strong boss with great presentation and lore to really drive home that Dark Souls 3 is going to be the GOAT of the series. One of the best bosses in the main game of Dark Souls 2. Velstad the Royal Aegis is great in almost every way, from his design to the music to the arena to his mechanics, etc. Velstad is the right-hand man of Vendrick and vowed to watch over his king until his dying days, even after Vendrick has long since gone hollow. His moveset is pretty well defined, with punishing attacks that can really chew your health down if you're not careful. In the second phase he will empower his weapon, making his attacks even more deadly and incorporating magic into them as well. All of this paired with the sick music and tolling of his bell every time he slams it down makes for a great presentation on this boss. Definitely one of the best bosses in the main Dark Souls 2 game, and a reminder that, in spite of its problems, this is still Dark Souls through and through. There is some extra lore on this guy, but I'd rather talk about that when we cover another character on this list. Speaking of which... What I think is a pretty overrated but still very solid boss is the Fume Knight, the second boss of the Crown of the Iron King DLC. The arena for this fight first off is gorgeous, with the blue tinted ash really giving it a unique aesthetic. As for the Fume Knight himself, he is mechanically very strong. In the first phase he will use a mixture of a smaller straight sword and a larger ultra great sword, which can be pretty difficult to avoid due to the nature of dual wielding weapons. But the second phase is definitely where this fight comes into its own, where he will switch to just two-handing his weapon with an added enchantment. His attacks in this phase are very well balanced and highly damaging, making for a real challenge, especially when you throw magic attacks into the mix that can be very difficult to avoid, as you have to move through them as they spiral out from his weapon. And if all of this wasn't enough, you can make this fight even harder by not destroying the 4 totems around the arena, which will allow him to heal during the fight. It can be an exceptionally difficult fight, and on my first playthrough I was here for ages trying to get him down. And of course, it's time to cover the story of the Fume Knight. Velstad was not Vendrick's only advisor. His other advisor was named Raim, but one day he and Velstad clashed, resulting in Raim being defeated and banished from Dran Lake as a traitor. He wandered the land seeking new purpose, until eventually he found Nadalia, a child of the dark. In her he found that purpose and vowed to protect her until his dying days. For his loyalty he was bestowed a dark magic that empowered his weapon, and he would remain amongst the ash of the tower until his service was needed. A very nice boss that continues the Dark Souls tradition of DLC bosses kicking ass. The first real dragon boss in the series is an absolute banger. Black Dragon Calamite not only is an amazing boss, but has one of the best build-ups in the series. When you first enter the DLC, you have a chance run-in with Calamite, who just flies off immediately afterwards, as if to say, you aren't even worthy of wasting my time on. And this is just shown even more later when you reach Calamite's arena, and he just flies overhead and kills you instantly. You truly are powerless against the true ancient dragon. But then with a bit of help from Hawkeye Goth, one of the Knights of Gwyn and one of the most badass cutscenes in the history of gaming, Calamite is downed, allowing you to face him 1v1. The fight itself has a really great soundtrack and arena, with this being the Darkroot Basin before it became that, which is a nice touch. Mechanically, Calamite is very strong, with head swipes, charge attacks, diving attacks, breath attacks, and more. He truly does feel like an epic battle against a legendary dragon, and I thoroughly enjoy it each and every playthrough. The only complaint I really have is that the camera can be a bit clunky at times, and the arena can result in some unfair deaths as well. Plus his head swipe does feel a bit inconsistent with dodging, which is frustrating for dodge only builds. But none of this is a deal breaker, and this remains as one of the strongest in the first game. Finally, we'll talk a bit about the lore. Calamite is an ancient dragon who was so powerful that even the legendary Knights of Anor Londo dared to provoke him. After he was defeated by the player character, his corpse was used by dragon worshippers to forge armor sets and weapons resembling the very creatures they worship, and these knights would eventually find themselves at the Dragon Shrine, where they would continue their quest for ascension to become dragons themselves, whilst also protecting their new master, the Ancient Dragon. In keeping with the dragon theme is the Dragon Slayer armor, Ornstein's bigger and burlier cousin, and just like Ornstein, this boss is exceptional. The presentation of this fight is top class, with the battle taking place on a bridge high into Lothric Castle with 2 giant pilgrim's butterflies on either side. It's a gorgeous arena that is only made better as the fight goes on. The Dragon Slayer armor has a wide variety of attacks, ranging from quick shield slams to delayed axe slams that can do an insane amount of damage if not taken seriously. The fact that this is one of the few bosses in the series that uses a shield is quite interesting, but the shield doesn't make the fight boring. If anything, it only enhances the fight. But the fight goes up to 11 in phase 2, where the butterflies on either side of the arena will start using ranged attacks, like magic rains or laser beams, that can do great damage and so have to be paid attention to. But the thing is, it's not unfair. because the sound they make will indicate they are charging up an attack, and may even indicate which attack at that. This, along with the fact that they're heavily telegraphed, means that it's fairly hard to get caught off guard by these attacks, which is very fair and good boss design. And by the way, the music in this fight slaps hard, especially in the second phase. Here, have a listen. Finally, we have to talk about the lore. The Dragon Slayers were once a group of elite knights of Lothric, who made it their goal to eliminate the threat of wyverns in the kingdom. To do this, they crafted specialised armour and weapons designed specially to counter wyverns, and modelled them after the legendary Dragon Slayer Ornstein's armour. With the help of the firstborn of Lord Gwyn, they learned how to harness lightning, known for its effectiveness against dragons, and destroyed the wyvern threat of the kingdom. They even learned to tame and ride them as well, making them a staple of Lothric's armies. Eventually there was no need for Dragon Slayers anymore, and so the armour was made a monument to the legendary knights. But when the Pilgrim's butterflies started to emerge, they used their magic to control the armour like a puppet, and allow it to engage in one last grand battle. A fantastic boss to keep up the wonderful consistency of Dark Souls 3. The fact that the Abyss Watchers are this low on the list just shows how many incredible bosses there are in this franchise. These guys are unbelievable in so many ways. Let's start with the lore. The Abyss Watchers are a legion made in honour of Knight Artorias, tasked with the duty of containing the Abyss at all costs, even destroying kingdoms just to do it. The Watchers consumed wolf blood to gain a stronger connection with Artorias, and this caused them to grow stronger, faster, and develop a pack-like mentality. Eventually the Watchers linked the fire, and were left with nothing to fight for after that, and so they went hollow and faded away. When they were awoken by the events of the third game, the entire land they fought for had been consumed by the Abyss, and so they endlessly fight and kill each other, as they too are all corrupted, just like their predecessor was. It's a story just as sad as Artorias is himself, and the fight absolutely does it justice. The fight starts out with one Abyss Watcher against you, who will utilise a large range of super beautiful attack patterns that never get old to watch. But the fight gets more interesting when a second and third Watcher will rise up, but the third one will actually be aggressive to both you and the other Abyss Watchers, and this is your edge during this phase. Once the second phase begins, the fight goes from amazing to amazing times 2. The Abyss Watcher's attacks in this phase are some of the most visually captivating in the entire franchise, with flipping and spinning all over the arena as gorgeous flame effects flow through the air. It's one of the best presentations of a boss in the franchise, and I enjoy it so damn much every time I do it. The only complaint I have about this fight is that the attacks just feel a tad on the messy side, but this is a very small gripe on this otherwise splendid boss. Oh, and did I mention the fucking music? Absolutely incredible. Truly the boss that showed the world that Dark Souls 3 is here and it fucking means business. As if the Abyss Watchers wasn't enough, we then have an even better Lord of Cinder later with the Twin Princes of Lothric. This boss is incredible. Let's start with the mechanics. In the first phase, the Elder Prince Lorien will slash at you with many different types of well-balanced attacks, but here's the catch. He will frequently teleport around the arena, making it harder to read his attacks. This simple addition is what makes this fight the truly great one that it is, and it only gets better in the second phase. In the second phase, Lothric himself will resurrect his brother and get on his back, adding magic into the mix on top of everything else. In this phase it can be hard to damage Lothric, so killing Lorien again becomes a necessity, but this will only give you a small window to damage Lothric, so you have to make it count. It's an exceptionally well balanced fight that never ceases to be exhilarating, and to make it even better, the music once again slaps hard and the presentation is top notch. And then finally, we have the lore. Prince Lothric was destined to become the next Lord of Cinder, but due to being born sickly and weak, he was unable to ever become the champion the kingdom needed. He was even tutored by Uldir, the Scholar of the First Sin, on the nature of the Age of Fire, and it was thanks to this that he began to doubt it. The constant cycle of linking the fire, the atrocities committed in the name of it, it all left a sour taste in his mouth. Osiris, however, kept trying, and thus fused the souls of the younger Prince Lothric with his elder brother Lorien, a knight of grand stature whose blade was permanently set ablaze after a fierce battle with the old Demon King. This fusion of souls was likely an attempt at making a soul worthy of linking the fire, and it did succeed, but it also resulted in Lorien becoming crippled and weakened just like his brother. Because of this and Lothric's doubt in the Age of Fire, he refused to link the flame, and remained in his keep with his brother to watch their kingdom fall. A fantastic way to wrap up the Lords of Cinder, and clearly cementing Dark Souls 3 as the game that finally did the Lord fights justice. Yes, you guessed it, it's another Dark Souls 3 boss, and it's right after the Twin Princes no less. The Nameless King is one of the coolest bosses in the series, with exceptional presentation, fantastic lore, a brilliant moveset, and tremendous difficulty. So why is he not in the top 10? Well, it's the first phase unfortunately. The fight opens up with you fighting the Storm Drake that he's riding on, and this could have been awesome, but the camera is an absolute nightmare in this phase, and hitting the bird is more annoying than fun. And it's a shame because the opening where he flies in on the Storm Drake and proceeds to fly around the arena throwing lightning spears at you is incredible. They were so close to a masterpiece, but just fumbled so hard with the first phase. But it's okay, because then we get into the second phase after an amazing power-up sequence, and it's so much better than the first phase, it's not even funny. In the second phase, the Nameless King will use a variety of charges, slashes, lightning magic, and more, and it's all very well balanced and nicely challenging. But one of the big things that makes this boss for me is the lore behind it. The Nameless King is said to be the long-lost firstborn child of Gwyn, and the heir of lightning, which is further hinted by his lightning powers and armour, which is very reminiscent of Gwyn. Back during the war against the dragons, the Nameless King fought alongside his father and dragon slayer Ornstein, and was unmatched in all of Gwyn's military. He created lightning miracles to combat the dragons, and formed the Warriors of Sunlight, who used their miracles and might to aid those in need. After Gwyn left to link the fire, the Nameless King took up his throne, and for a time led his people to greatness, even building the cities of New Londo and the Undead Burg, as homes for the undead to find worthy heirs for the fire. However, soon the travesties started. Seath the Scaleless lost himself to his research, the four kings of New Londo were corrupted by the dark, the father of the abyss Manus was unleashed upon Ulusil, Knight Artorius was lost to the dark, and occult weapons began making their way into Anor Londo, thanks to people like Havel the Rock, with the goal of overthrowing the gods. Eventually, the Nameless King, for unknown reasons, decided to sacrifice everything and allied himself with the ancient dragons, befriending a storm drake that would become his trusty companion. Of course, in the eyes of Anor Londo, this was an unforgivable sin, and the king was banished from his home, but not before he was able to leave behind his Sunlight Blade miracle and some flowers for his deceased father. Since then, the Nameless King has remained a legend among the Warriors of Sunlight, even though all his statues were broken, and even by the time the kingdom had become Dranleic, and eventually Lothric. It's a fascinating story that begs so many questions, such as, why did he ally with the ancient dragons over his own people? This boss could have truly been one of the best in the franchise, but it was just let down by the first phase. That being said, it is still a spectacular boss that will always be remembered. The final boss of Dark Souls 1's DLC, and what a banger it is. Manus, Father of the Abyss, is widely considered one of the hardest bosses in the first game, and for good reason. This guy will move quickly around the arena and attack with aggressive delayed attacks that can be very challenging. Not only this, but he possesses various dark magics as well, which can kill you instantly if you're not careful. But here's the catch. It's possible to acquire a silver pendant earlier in Ulasil, which will allow you to completely negate this dark magic. This is a game changer for me, as this adds a level of complexity to the fight that no other fight in the series has. Yes, I know it's a little unfair for people that didn't find the pendant, but I don't care. Using the pendant during the fight is so awesome and fun, and it's really the thing that sets this boss apart from others in the series. Of course, we also need to talk about the impeccable presentation on this fight. From the boss's amazing design, to the creepy dark arena, to the fascinating lore surrounding Manus himself. The story goes that Manus was once a human like us, and possessed a powerful dark soul. He used this soul to develop his own dark magic, and was known as the primordial human. After his death, he was buried underneath the land Ulasil would be built on, but with the influence of Darkstalker Kaf, the people of Ulasil unearthed his body and stole his broken pendant, which was said to be a precious memento of a long-lost love. Stealing this pendant drove Manus mad, and he reawakened a dark monstrosity, seeking his pendant at all costs. His dark soul raged so hard that the citizens of Ulasil were corrupted, and the land was infested. Even Knight Artorias himself was unable to defeat Manus, and was also consumed by the Abyss. Eventually Manus was able to find his pendant, but due to time distortion, he could also sense the presence of another far in the future in the hands of the player character, and so he brings you to the past to reclaim your pendant as well. But the story doesn't end there. After Manus was defeated, his dark soul split into 4 fragments, and these fragments would become his daughters in a sense. Their names were Elena, Alsana, Nadalia, and of course, Nashandra. A fascinating story that really shows why I've always been more infatuated with the dark side of the lore in the franchise. A fantastic way to end the first DLC of the series. The second amazing dragon boss of the series, and it's in Dark Souls 2 as well. Safe to say they really stepped up their boss design in the DLCs. Sin the Slumbering Dragon is amazing in almost every way, from his design to the arena to his moveset to the build up. It's truly great stuff. Mechanically he's pretty similar to Black Dragon Calamite, but the difference is that Sin is much more mobile and more interesting to fight as a result, and also doesn't have any of the problems present with Calamite, such as the camera or the unavoidable attacks. The build up of meeting Sin when you first enter the Sunken King DLC is a great little teaser, and seeing him again later when he burns the bridge and flies off is awesome. Unfortunately lore-wise Sin doesn't have the most to work with, but it's still a cool story nonetheless. Sin was an ancient dragon who was poisoned and fell into an endless slumber in the caverns of Shulva. When the Sunken King found him, he and his people began worshipping him, and built their sanctum city around him to protect him. They also built the Dragon Sanctum, where they would sing to him and ensure his peaceful slumber could continue. But when Sir Yorg invaded the city, the Sunken King was killed, and Sin was awoken in a rage. Yorg and Sin engaged in epic battle, but Yorg was crushed by his might, and the poison that had been building inside Sin erupted out, completely destroying the Sanctum City. A pretty damn nice dragon fight that once again absolutely showed that Dark Souls 2 is capable when it tries. Out of all the bosses on this list, one of the most emotional fights in the franchise is Sif the Great Grey Wolf. Normally this fight begins with Sif grabbing the sword and beginning to fight, but if you do the DLC first, then this fight hits so much harder in the feels. Sif is the trusted wolf companion of Knight Artorias, and they both traverse the Abyss together. However, once deep into the abyss, it started to consume Artorias, and eventually he would be defeated by Manus in battle, so he sacrificed his arm and his great shield to protect Sif from the raging humanity. When you find Sif in the cave, he will howl as if to say thank you, and can even then fight alongside you against Manus. Then if you go to the grave after doing all of this, then the cutscene will be different. Sif will recognise you after all these years and audibly start whimpering, even letting out a mournful howl. But still, he will pick up the sword because he vowed to protect his master's grave no matter what. Not only that, but because he also knows why you're here. You want the Ring of Artorias to traverse the abyss, but Sif won't let what happened to his master happen to you as well. It's an intensely emotional story and has even made me tear up before, and makes it hurt so much when you have to kill Sif. And just when you thought things couldn't get any sadder, the music perfectly conveys the sorrowful tone of this battle more than words ever could. Mechanically, Sif is a strong boss with fast and balanced movements that can pose a real challenge, especially if you challenge Sif earlier in the game, which is totally doable. But the real final gut punch of this fight is close to the end, where Sif will start limping and barely be able to swing his sword anymore, even falling over occasionally. It's one of the saddest fights in the series, and an absolute masterpiece of a fight lore-wise. Rest in peace, Sif. You are a wonderful wolf and a dear friend. I said earlier that Velstad was one of the best bosses in the main game of Dark Souls 2, but this one is the absolute best. The Dark Lurker is one of the most well balanced and well crafted double boss fights in the entire series, and I absolutely adore it every chance I get to do it. The fight starts off simple enough with one Dark Lurker and his various attacks, but the fight becomes extremely interesting and challenging when he spawns a clone of himself that will do anything it pleases. This works so well with this fight because the Dark Lurker's moveset works perfectly for a double fight. From its portal explosives, to its fireball attack, to its laser beam, it all just works so well in the context of a double fight, and is perfectly telegraphed. That's the best way I can describe this fight. Perfectly crafted. None of this is even mentioning the music, which is awesome. And the arena, a dark depths deep within the dark chasm of the abyss. Its nice presentation combined with excellent mechanics and difficulty make this a truly magnificent boss that really makes me confused as to why this was made a Covenant boss of all things, and an obscure one at that. Why From Software? This should have been a main story boss with how good it is. Strangely, there's absolutely no lore on who or what the Dark Lurker is, and the only suggestion we have is that the Dark Lurker is a remnant of an ancient being. Oh well, still an incredible boss that I highly recommend you check out if you haven't already. The first boss of the Ring City DLC is fucking awesome as expected. The Demon Prince is one of the best double bosses in the series, with a fighting style similar to the Bell Tower Gargoyles. One will be more aggressive than the other at a time, but each possess a variety of ranged attacks to keep the player on their toes. Not to mention the presentation of this fight is excellent, with you taking a huge plunge into the depths below the Dreg Heap, only to be greeted by these two. It's a brilliant opener to an amazing fight that only gets better in the second half. Unlike most double bosses, these two can be killed separately, but depending on which you kill second will determine which one will become the true Demon Prince. The transformation sequence is incredible, and the boss that follows is even better than the first phase. The Demon Prince adopts many of the moves of his former self, but depending on which you killed second, will adopt extra moves, adding new complexity to the fight. If you fight the orange variant of the Demon Prince, then he will gain a variety of laser attacks, and if you fight the red variant, then he will gain various fireball attacks instead. Not only do these attacks all look amazing, but couple that with the solid balance, decent challenge and great music, and you have yourself one killer boss fight. Finally there's the lore, and while not extensive, is still pretty interesting. The Chaos Flame, just like the first flame, can be reignited by a demon champion, and so the old Demon King went to face Lorien, the older son of Osiris, in battle, but was defeated and unable to achieve this. The demons we encounter under the Dreadkeep are theorized to be the last demons alive, and so when only one remains, that demon shall be reborn as the new host of the Chaos Flame and be named the Demon Prince. Excellent way to open up the final chapter of Dark Souls. At long last, we have reached the top 10, and what better way to open it up than with one of the most intense and well balanced fights in the series. Champion Gundyr starts out as a souped up version of Iudex Gundyr, who we've already established was a great boss, but this fight really comes into its own in the second phase. The main problem I had with Iudex Gundyr was how the second phase felt more messy than the first, but with Champion Gundyr, this problem is nowhere to be found. In the second phase, Champion Gundyr will adopt new moves and become even more aggressive than before, becoming one of the most relentless bosses in the franchise. But he's so damn well balanced that it makes for an incredibly fun challenge that I almost wish never ended. We haven't even mentioned the presentation yet, mind you. The concept of revisiting the starting area had already been explored in Dark Souls 1, but not an alternate dark version of the starting area, complete with a non-corrupted version of its boss. The arena looks so much better in the dark, and it's a very cool bit of nostalgia revisiting the starting area, with the added intrigue of what this place actually is. This is what the Stray Demon should have been. Finally, it's time we talk about the lore of Gundyr. Gundyr was once a great champion of Lothric, tasked with linking the First Flame, but when he travelled to Firelink Shrine, he was bound by a chain ring and sent into an abyss called the Untended Graves, a location deep within Lothric Castle where past, present and future coexist. The origin of the Untended Graves is a point in the past where the flame was almost completely extinguished, to the point that even the Firelink Shrine was abandoned. In this dark place there was no one to greet Gundyr, and thus he was left stranded in this dark place without purpose. Then along came a mysterious challenger who defeated him in combat, and he was impaled on the coiled sword and turned into a golem to test the unkindled when they would rise from their graves. The saddest part of the story is that the person that tasked Gundyr with becoming a champion was the very person who doomed him to this fate as well. By the time of the events of Dark Souls 3, Champion Gundyr had become Iudex Gundyr, the Judge of Ash. However, unfortunately for the Ashen One, the humanity within Gundyr had raged out of control over the years, manifesting itself as the horrific pus of man in Gundyr's last battle. A confusing story, but a really good one nonetheless. Excellent boss and a challenge that I will never get tired of. And finally, we have made it to the SS tier. The bosses of this level are not just amazing fights on their own, but represent the series at its absolute peak. These are some of the greatest boss fights in all of gaming to me, and I thoroughly love each and every one of them. Without further ado, let's begin. The final boss of the first game is everything we all hoped it would be. Gwyn is one of the most thematically strong fights in the series, and there's so much to talk about with this one. Let's start with the extensive tale of the Lord of Sunlight. Gwyn was one of the original beings that found a Lord Soul, thus becoming a god and named the Lord of Sunlight. With the Lord Soul, he and his Silver Knights challenged the Archdragons for control of the surface. The war was hard fought, and Gwyn and his allies lost many of their soldiers to the powerful and exceedingly hard to kill dragons. However, a turning point happened when Sif the Scaleless betrayed his own kind, and revealed to Gwyn that the dragon's weakness was lightning, and so Gwyn developed lightning miracles and weapons, and used them to peel apart the dragon's stone scales. During the war, Gwyn would also discover the descendants of the furtive pygmy and their dark souls. These humans were very powerful, and while they would make strong allies, they would also spark Gwyn's fear of humanity. Eventually, the dragons were defeated, and Gwyn decided to gift the pygmy lords his daughter Filianor and the marvellous Ringed City, a city built deep under the Dreadheap, where the dark soul could be kept safe. However, it's more likely that this was just a ploy for Gwyn to seal away the Dark Soul forever, thus preventing humanity from ever being able to overthrow the gods. With the Dark Souls sealed away and the dragons defeated, the Age of Fire began. However, eventually the first flame began to fade, and Gwyn trembled at the dark, deciding to link the fire in order to prolong the Age of Fire and cast away the dark. He would entrust his knights and his friend King Seeker Framt to corral the undead so that they may find champions who would also link the fire and continue the age just like Gwyn did. After a long and arduous journey, you have become that very champion and are sent on one final quest to defeat Gwyn and link the fire once more. When you finally meet Gwyn, he has become old and hollowed from keeping the fire burning for so very long, and now there is only a small flame left. This is exactly what will happen to you if you choose to link the fire. It's a dark realization that really makes you question whether the cycle should be prolonged or not. This somber theme is captured perfectly by the music as well, which is one of the greatest boss themes in all of Dark Souls. You probably know it already, but let's just enjoy it for a while, shall we? Not only is this fight so fiercely strong narratively, but it also really does not disappoint in the mechanics department. Gwyn hits hard and very fast, demanding fast reaction times and the ability to read his mix-ups and react accordingly. Few other fights in the series demand this kind of fighting style, and it works very well, posing a severe challenge. But the thing is, you can instead opt to just parry Gwyn, with him being the only boss in the original game to be able to be parried. This ties in perfectly with the story. Gwyn is not the god that he used to be. He's a withered old man who can't even use his signature lightning magic anymore. Absolutely perfect ending to the original Dark Souls, and a testament to the strong themes of the series. Following up the fairly average champion's grave tender is an absolute monolith of a fight with Father Ariandel and Sister Frida. Let's start with the backstory of these two. Father Ariandel is the one who restored the painted world of Ariandel after the painted world of Ariamis rotted away. Sister Frida was once simply known as Elfrida, and she was a trusted maiden of Darkstalker Karth. From Karth she would learn about the Age of Dark, an age where the flame was extinguished and humans thrive. Elfrida would establish the Sable Church as a refuge for people who had suffered much in their lives, and eventually would even attempt to usurp the flame and begin the Age of Dark. However, she would fail and become an unkindled just like us, eventually being awoken to fulfill her duties as an Ashen One. However, she had no interest in aiding the Age of Fire, and would leave behind her kingdom of Londor, the Sable Church, and even her name, becoming simply known as Frida. Eventually she would be drawn into the painted world of Ariandel, and would befriend the forlorn within, just like she befriended the downtrodden in Londor. When she gained the trust of Father Ariandel, she convinced him to snuff out the flame, even as the world began to rot, so that they could die together with the world instead of burning it away to create a new one. To make sure that the flame would never reignite, Ariandel would constantly flail himself and bleed onto the flame, preventing it from ever alighting again. However, there was a prophecy told by the painter and her faithful knight Gale. When the ashes are two, a flame alighteth. This is why you are brought to this world, to fulfill the prophecy, free the painter, and reignite the flame so that a new world can be painted and this rotting world can be burned away. But Sister Frida won't give up the world without a fight. The fight begins with Sister Frida on her own, who possesses a variety of wicked combos and frost magic that makes for a good challenge on its own, but where this fight really gets interesting is with her invisibility. This isn't the first time we've seen invisibility in the series, but here it's done so much better than with Priscilla. Upon going invisible, Frida will swiftly move around the arena, and the only way to find her is to pay attention to the dust she kicks up and the sound of her movements. It's a very cool use of the mechanic that adds great depth to the fight, but we haven't even gotten into the second phase yet. Once Sister Frida is killed, Ariandel will become enraged to the point of reigniting the flame in order to revive her, thus fulfilling the prophecy, but until the fight ends, the flame will not be safe. In the second phase, the fight becomes a double fight, with Father Ariandel hitting slow but hard, and Frida becoming more of a ranged fighter and support with her frost magic and healing spells. And just to make things even better, Slave Knight Gale will join you in this phase to help you, which is just so cool. Finally, after the two of them are defeated, you think it's all over at last, but then... The third phase begins and the music swells into an incredible boss track as Frida attacks with some of the most gorgeous moves in the whole damn franchise. In this phase, Frida will gain a second scythe and black flame magic, making her already fierce moveset even more deadly, with some of the most damaging and visually captivating combos I've ever seen. It's an absurdly challenging, beautifully presented boss that killed me time and time and time again on my first playthrough, and I truly can't sing its praises enough. Absolutely magnificent. One of the absolute best. Yes indeed, it's finally time. Ornstein and Smough. If you ask anyone to name a Dark Souls boss, then 90% of people will name these two, and there's a very good reason for that. These two are the boss that really showed the world what a Dark Souls boss is capable of, in every aspect, from the presentation to the lore to the mechanics, music and more. Let's start with the lore. Ornstein is the captain of the Knights of Gwyn, and basically the right-hand man of the Lord of Sunlight, alongside the Nameless King. Together during the war against the dragons, Ornstein and the Nameless King led the Dragon Slayers under them, and became legends for their contribution to the war. Eventually, after the Nameless King was exiled from Anor Londo, Ornstein remained in the keep, alongside Smough as the last line of defence for Princess Guinevere, and serving as the last test for any chosen undead strong enough to make it this far. However, after hundreds of years with no worthy undead in sight, Ornstein left the city, leaving his ring and soul behind, and heading off to find the Nameless King once more. This implies that the being you fight in-game is not actually Ornstein, but merely a golem that Gwyndolin brought to life, using Ornstein's soul. As for the big guy, Smough was the executioner of Gwyn's army. However, Smough loved his job so much that he started eating the ground bones of the people he executed, and so was never granted the official title of knight. Still though, he too was tasked to protect Princess Guinevere from any intruders. Mechanically, these two are one of the strongest bosses in the original game. Ornstein is quick and possesses a variety of magic attacks, whereas Smough is slower but big and strong with a hammer that can do huge damage with its charging attacks. Fighting these two in the first phase is incredibly well balanced, as their moves complement one another perfectly, and it makes for an intense fight that demands a lot of patience to get in your attacks. Now where things get really cool is when one is killed. Just like the Demon Prince, these two can be killed separately, And again, just like the Demon Prince, depending on which you kill first will determine who will be your second phase. Smo will simply gain the lightning of Ornstein and not really change much, but Ornstein will grow large and adopt a whole new moveset, making him easily the more interesting of the two to fight in the second phase. It's the first boss fight in the series to really have a second phase, and it really was groundbreaking at the time for Dark Souls bosses. The music also just complements this fight so well, with an iconically epic tone to it. The only complaint I can muster for this fight is that sometimes Smo's charge attacks can be a bit unavoidable when he's too close to you, but thankfully this doesn't really affect the fight. Absolutely deserving of its legendary status. While I do think these two have been surpassed at this point, they still remain one of the most iconic and best bosses in the series. As for the best boss in Dark Souls 1, well, it just had to be Knight Artorias. This fight absolutely elevated what a boss could be in the series, with perfectly balanced mechanics, incredible presentation, strong music that perfectly fits the tone of the fight, an iconic design, and a backstory that makes everyone want to cry so hard. Knight Artorias is one of the Knights of Gwyn, and was known as the Abyss Walker. Before making his way to Ulisil, he was sent to New Londo to defeat the Dark Wraiths and contain the Abyss, but was unsuccessful, causing the city to have to be flooded. In spite of his failure, he was sent to Ulisil to contain the Abyss that had broken out from the depths of the city. Artorias and Sif made their way into the Abyss and challenged Manus, but unfortunately were defeated. After having his arm broken in a last-ditch effort to protect Sif, Artorias sacrificed his great shield and was left defenseless to the raging humanity of the Abyss. A being without a sliver of dark in them cannot exist within the Abyss, and so Artorias was driven mad by its all-consuming blackness. Up until this point, you had always heard that Artorias was the Abyss Walker and held back the spread of the Abyss, but this is not what stands before you here. It's a dark revelation that brings up many questions, such as, if Artorias failed, does that mean that we are actually the one who stopped the Abyss? We've been talking this whole time about the lore and haven't even mentioned the mechanics yet. This fight is one of the most well-balanced, fun fights in the whole series. Artorias will be flipping and rolling and jumping around the arena constantly, doing big damage if not dodged properly. Every single move he busts out during the fight is totally fair and visually beautiful, and things get even more intense when he begins to power up, which can be interrupted, but if you don't, then in this state he will start doing huge damage that can easily one-shot you if you're not careful. All of this combined with his high aggression makes it very hard to get a hit in or even a drink off. It's an exhilarating fight with a tremendously profound story behind it that has become a staple of the franchise, and it absolutely deserves all the love it gets. Of course, the music as well is very much loved, with a very dark and depressing tone to it. Bravo, Knight Artorias, you are the best boss in Dark Souls 1, and yet, we still aren't even at the top 5 yet. Starting out the top 5 is a Dark Souls 2 boss. I know, it's crazy, but Dark Souls 2 really went all out with its DLCs, and the Burnt Ivory King is a masterpiece in every way. The Burnt Ivory King was a great man who travelled the land and established the kingdom of Ilium Lois, far in the north. Eventually the city was visited by a child of the dark named Alsana, who sought to use the Ivory King to sustain herself. Still, being the compassionate individual he was, the Ivory King took Alsana in and gave her a home in Ilium Lois. Things were great in the kingdom for a time, until the chaos emerged. Buried deep under the city was the remnants of the Chaos Flame created by the Witch of Izalith. Legend has it that in order to contain the Chaos Flame, the Ivory King intentionally built his kingdom on top of it. He even built his throne room directly above the Chaos in order to oversee it personally, and one day he led his knights into the Chaos to seal it away once and for all. But unfortunately, he failed, and he and his army were completely consumed by the Chaos, and their armour was charred black and their sanity was lost. When you arrive to the city, the Chaos is being contained by Alsana, but the city has been destroyed. She contained the Chaos Flame by freezing the city to the point where it's hard to even see, but after you defeat Ava, she asks you to gather the Lois Knights remaining around the city and venture into the Chaos to put the Ivory King to rest. Once you've gathered the knights, you make your way down the stairs and take the plunge into the Chaos with one of the absolute coolest transitions in all of gaming. The lore to this fight is fantastic, but even that isn't the best part. That would have to be the presentation. The entrance to the Chaos is mind-blowing. The arena is one of the best in the franchise. The spectacle of fighting against the charred Lois army with your allies is incredible and epic, and the entrance of the Burnt Ivory King himself is one of the coolest introductions of a boss in the whole franchise. The only complaint I can possibly levy at this fight is the fact that having all 4 knights with you makes it a little on the easy side, because the 4th knight will not sacrifice himself to close the portals, thus allowing him to fight the king alongside you, which kinda cuts the difficulty in half. But if you only bring 3 knights along, then this fight is exceptional. The Burnt Ivory King has all kinds of wicked moves, combos, jumping attacks, and a bloody lightsaber power up on his weapon, making for one of the coolest boss designs in the series. Bosses in a lot of Dark Souls 2, as we know, don't feel super well designed as they were in the other games, but the Burnt Ivory King is Knight Artorias levels of balance and difficulty. It's an absurdly strong fight mechanically, lore-wise, and especially in the presentation. Absolute marvellous masterpiece and a highlight of Dark Souls 2, and yet it's still not the best boss this game has to offer. Sir Alon is one of the most chilling bosses in the franchise, and I can't even begin to describe how much I adore this fight. Sir Alon is a samurai who came to Dranleg from the east in search of a king to serve, and so he found and served the Iron King, but at the peak of his rule he set out once again for unknown reasons, and the Knights of the Iron Keep were named after him in his honour. And once we get into the fight, we see firsthand the legend that is Sir Alon. While I do wish the lore of Alon was a bit more detailed, it's okay because the main appeal here is the presentation and the fight itself. He will charge and leap around the arena and strike with a mixture of fast stabs and slower charges. Reading the speed of his attacks can be a real challenge, and his moveset is so incredibly fun to fight against, and this comboed with the reflective marble floor makes for an almost Dance of Death-like feel for the fight. The arena for this fight is one of the most visually beautiful in the series, with the sunset in the background and the gorgeous floor. But the big thing that elevates this fight for me is the fucking music. Holy mother of mercy. There are a few boss tracks in the series to reach this level, and it elevates this already epic fight to the levels of a legendary duel between 2 mighty warriors, surpassing even Artorias. Absolute insanity of a boss, and a spectacle that truly has to be seen to be believed. Well done, Sir Alon. You are the best boss in Dark Souls 2. But even after all of that, there are still 3 bosses left, and they are all from one game, and I think you know which game that is. This fight is a miracle. This has got to be the best fight against a dragon in any piece of art ever created. Dark Eater Midir has everything. Peerless presentation, an incredible backstory, a spectacular moveset, one of the most gorgeous arenas in the franchise, a beautiful design, unreal music, relentless difficulty. Like, Jesus Christ, how the hell does this franchise do it? I can't handle this, it's too much awesome. Crikey, where the hell do we begin? How about the lore? Midir is an ancient dragon adopted and raised by the Ring City, with the duty of protecting Princess Filianore and battling against the Abyss. Due to him being an everlasting dragon, this meant that he could carry out his duties indefinitely, but even an ancient dragon is not resistant to the consuming darkness of the Abyss. As his duty continued, Midir became corrupted by the dark, and started to lose his senses. It's unclear whether he is still sane by the time we meet him in game, but the Church of Filianore plead with you to kill him all the same, to ensure that he can die with honour intact. It's a great story that really showcases the ancient dragons in a new light. Even they are not immune to the Abyss's dark touch, but they are also honourable souls deserving of respect. You first encounter Midir in an idle state when entering the Ring City, but upon getting deeper into it, you will be greeted by him fully awake and ready to fuck you up. His sheer size and stature is truly a sight to behold, and puts even Calamite to shame, because while Calamite looked incredible, he didn't really have the scale of a truly legendary ancient creature. After evading Midir initially, you then have to fight him off a cliff later, evading his claw swipes and his absolutely unbelievable laser attack, which makes me just want to nerdgasm like crazy. After knocking him off the edge, you can then venture down into the depths below the Ring City to face him proper. This arena not only looks absolutely marvellous, but also may very well be the cave where the Dark Soul was discovered in the first game's intro cutscene. And if that's the case, then this is one of the best boss arenas in video games. Now it's finally time to get into the mechanics. Midir has a ridiculous amount of health, which is perfect for an ancient dragon like him, and his moveset matches his stature perfectly. He will rage, he will breathe fire, he will fly up in the air, he will shoot his concentrated laser beams that just nerdgasm. It's not only ball-bustingly difficult, but incredibly well balanced and very fun at the same time. But where this fight goes up to insane levels is in the second phase. The music in this phase is one of my favourite boss tracks in video games, and you just have to listen to it. As if his moveset wasn't cool enough, well, in this phase he will not only adopt various dark based attacks, but he will even adopt a giant mega laser barrage that will chew your health up like fried chicken if you don't dodge all of it, and is without a doubt one of the coolest looking attacks in any video game. I haven't even mentioned the fact that Midir has absolutely no blind spots or weaknesses whatsoever. If you try to get underneath him, then he will just burn the ground around him, which means that the only option you have in this fight is to fight him fair and square and stay in front of him. It's an absolute marvel of a boss fight that elevates the very concept of what a video game boss can be, and I have no qualms in saying that it's the greatest dragon boss fight in all of gaming. The final boss of Dark Souls 3 hit me so hard in the feels that I wanted to cry. The Soul of Cinder is an absolutely perfect ending to the game, and there's so much to go over with this one. Returning to the kiln of the First Flame after all this time and witnessing the giant heap of civilizations that it's become is truly a sight to behold, especially with the radiant solar eclipse in the sky that almost looks like a bleeding sun. The approach up the kiln just has you wondering, what's waiting for us at the top? In both previous games, you kinda knew what was waiting for you at the end, but with this game, you have no idea, and when you get to the top, you are greeted by a field of flowers with swords strewn about it. It's one of the most fitting visuals in the series. The final boss is revealed to be the Soul of Cinder, an amalgamation of every single Lord of Cinder to ever link the fire, including your own characters, and it shows throughout the fight. The Soul of Cinder will start off by using a simple straight sword with fairly difficult attacks, but then things get amazing when he switches out his weapon for a different weapon type. He has a spear which will come with an ability to use miracles, a scimitar which comes with the ability to use pyromancies, and a catalyst which comes with the ability to use sorcery. What better way to end the series than with a boss that uses every kind of fighting style in this series? It's a true marvel to fight against, and the intense score turns it up all the way to 11. But the thing is, the fight has barely gotten started yet. Once you kill the Soul of Cinder, you think the fight is over, but then he stabs his sword in the ground, and this will start playing. When this started up in my first playthrough, I wanted to cry with sheer unbridled joy. Seeing him bust out all the same moves as Gwyn, with even a few extra ones, was such a magical experience that just had me floored as I witnessed it. The extra additions to Gwyn's moveset are so perfect as well, with the big combo move that absolutely destroys your health, the lightning stick attack, or even the sunlight spear rain. A legendary move created by Gwyn that we never got to see in the first game because Gwyn was withered and hollowed. Very few other fights in games have ever blown me away like this one, and I will never forget it for the rest of my life. An absolutely perfect way to end the greatest game franchise in the world. But yet, the franchise wasn't completely finished. The story of Dark Souls was yet to reach its true, final conclusion. What do I even say? Slave Knight Gale is my favourite boss fight in all of gaming, and fighting him is probably my favourite thing I've ever done in a game. I know I said that the Soul of Cinder was the final boss in Dark Souls 3, but Slave Knight Gale is the final boss of the franchise as a whole. Gale is not just a good Dark Souls boss, he's an absolute landmark moment in the history of the medium. There is not a single aspect about this fight that isn't the best in the entire franchise by a large margin. I don't even know if I could sum it all up in one session, but I will try my damnedest because this fight means more to me than you know. Let's start with the lore. Gale is a slave knight who were once undead used as fodder in wars due to their immortality. Eventually Gale escaped this grim fate and found a new home in the painted world of Ariandel, where he met and befriended the painter. However, as time went on, the world started to rot and decay, and the new world had to be painted in its place. But as we know, Sister Frida wouldn't allow this, and so Gale set out on a journey to find an Ashen One to show the painter flame and burn the rotten world away, so that a new and better world could be born in its place. He set out on this quest knowing full well that he was no hero, that he had little hope of safe return, but he never gave up no matter how hard things got. The similarities between him and you should be clear by now. Gale is a faceless undead just like you, and only got through his quest because of his unwavering will, just like you have every time you've died over and over and over throughout this series. After countless ages of searching, Gale prayed to the gods, begging for an Ashen One to complete the prophecy and show his Lady Flame, when he finally meets you near the Cathedral of the Deep. Overjoyed from finally finding you, he offers you the rotted scrap of Ariandel as a gateway to the world so that you can fulfill your promise. He will then aid you against Father Ariandel and Sister Frida to ensure that you complete the prophecy and reignite the flame for Ariandel. After showing the painting girl Flame, she will finally be free to paint the new world. However, the world she wished for was a cold, dark and gentle one, and the only way to create such a world was with the Dark Soul itself. And so, Gale sets out on another even more impossible task of finding the Dark Soul and bringing its blood back to the painter. When you talk to the painter, she will wonder whether Gale has found the pigment coloured like the Dark Soul of man yet, and so you set off to the Dreadkeep, hoping to join Gale in his search. Once you make it to the Dreadkeep, you will find messages left for you by Gale, guiding you through the rubble to reach the Ring City below. Once again he will join you to fight against the Demon Prince, but then you will not meet him again for a while. After finally reaching Princess Filianor, you are transported to the Pygmy Throne, located in a sandy wastelands with remnants of old kingdoms standing in the distance. Where and when the Pygmy Throne is located is completely unknown, but many theorise that it resides far in the future and is unreachable to most people. Once you leave the building, you come across a Pygmy Lord begging Princess Filianor to help him, and when you reach the thrones, you only find the corpses of all the lords, and then you find him. At last, you find Gale. His quest left him travelling and searching for the Pygmy Lords for what was likely hundreds of years, leaving him completely broken. But never once did he give up. His sword became stained with blood, all of his weapons became broken and battered. The only weapon he kept with him the whole time was his sword, which now closer resembles a battered slab of metal rather than a blade. He modified his crossbow to be able to gun down packs of enemies. He uses a miracle so old that he's become its only remaining user, and by the time you find him, he is said to be the last undead alive. His long quest has even caused his armour to fuse with his body. After he finally found the Pygmy Lords, he discovered that their blood had dried long ago and would not yield the pigment that he sought after. Saddened and angered by this, he slit the throats of the Pygmy Lords and began to eat their bodies in the hopes of gaining the Dark Soul for himself. His body mutated and grew larger, and a huge hole opened up in his stomach. His body and mind was ruined by the Dark Soul, and when he sees you, he only seeks your portion of the Dark Soul. It's clear his quest has left him on the brink of hollowing, and when you refuse, at long last, the fight begins. The fight starts off with Gale on all fours, moving quickly around the arena and attacking with swift sword slashes that can be very damaging if not dodged correctly. You'll quickly notice his absurd amount of health, and this is so incredibly perfect. Far too many bosses in Dark Souls end way too soon, but Gale, absolutely not. This will be a long and epic fight, just like Midir. He will also strike with charging grab attacks, which, while not too difficult to avoid, will do big damage if landed. A big weakness of Gale is that if you hit him enough, then he will stagger for a bit, giving you an opportunity to strike, but you can't get too greedy because he quickly recovers and strikes back. It's the only microscopic thing that I can complain about with this fight, because while it does well to balance the fight, I just wish that I didn't have any advantages in this fight, because I want to enjoy it and its challenge for as long as possible. My only real complaint about this fight is that I don't get to enjoy it for long enough, and it's already the longest fight in the franchise. Can we just think about that for a second? Anyway, on top of all of this, he will occasionally go into a rage and slash all over the arena, which can be pretty difficult to avoid and can do high damage if not dodged. The incredibly large arena and absolutely gorgeous visual of the sunset in the background, combined with Gale's beautiful moveset, makes this the most beautifully presented boss in the series. Combine that with the exceptional music, and you have yourself an 11 out of 10 masterpiece of a boss fight. But this is all just phase 1. In phase 2, Gale will go hollow upon realising that his blood has become the Dark Soul. The fact that he remembered his duty until going hollow is quite rare, as hollows will usually lose their memory gradually as the curse progresses. But with Gale, it's clear that his duty had become everything to him, and he would never let himself forget. Such unwavering resolve and such unrelenting determination is nary seen in any other character in not only Dark Souls, but all of gaming. It's simply awe-inspiring. The sight of him turning hollow and being consumed by the Dark Soul as the music ramps up and the weather turns into a violent storm is one of the most chilling visuals I've ever borne witness to in a game, and the way the score swells as the fight resumes is just cinema. The second phase begins and Gale's moves become less frantic and adopt an after-trail effect from his cloak, forcing the player to refine their dodging technique and time their rolls correctly, which, in a fight this long, is absolutely crucial. It's easily one of the most carefully crafted and masterfully balanced fights to have ever been made, and it gets even better. Gale will start utilising his machine gun crossbow in this phase, which will gnaw your health down if you don't keep moving. And on top of this, he will use an empowered version of the Way of White Corona, which will throw out multiple discs at once. It's such a varied and incredible moveset that, combined with the gorgeous effects, incredibly beautiful arena, and impeccable score, make for something that I almost can't believe is real. And then, just when you think things have peaked, Gale will enter into the third phase, where the Dark Soul begins raging out of control, and he will begin flying around the arena, attacking with flip strikes, mid-air crossbow shots, and leaking remnants of the Dark Soul everywhere that will cause lightning to strike the arena. The storm stirred up by the Dark Soul increases in intensity, and Gale's pain moans ring out as the soul ravages his body. The music goes from a 10 out of 10 in the first phase to an 11 out of 10 in the second phase, and then to a 100 out of 10 in the third phase, to the point that I would say that it's one of the greatest pieces of music I've ever heard in my life. The music reaching its apex, the gorgeous visuals of the entire fight, the thoroughly exhilarating moveset accompanying a story for the ages make this a spectacle that I legit cannot believe exists. While doing this fight, I no longer feel like I'm playing Dark Souls. This fight feels too good to be a Dark Souls boss, and that is something that I do not say lightly, in any way, shape or form. I haven't even talked about the thematic genius of this fight yet, and I really need to because it's the final thing that really is the cherry on the cake. No other boss in the series has such a strong connection to the player, outside of Sif in Dark Souls 1, but the connection that Gale has with the player runs far deeper. Not only are you former allies, but you are alike in so many ways. Most bosses in Dark Souls involve fights against legendary knights or giant dragons, etc. But the difference with Gale is that he is just a simple undead, just like how you are a simple unkindled. The final battle of the world being a fight between a faceless undead and a faceless unkindled for the Dark Soul itself, in a giant desert of nothingness while nobody is around to even watch, is such a perfect thematic conclusion to the series of Dark Souls that I can't stress it enough. In every aspect, Slave Knight Gale is the greatest boss in Dark Souls by a huge margin. The music is simply unmatched, the arena is both gorgeous and thematically perfect, Gale's story is the most engaging and emotional story that I've ever heard in this franchise, his moveset is the most diverse and well balanced moveset in the whole franchise, and is an absolute treat for the eyes on top of everything else. The thematic elements of the fight and Gale as a character surpass even Gwyn, and perfectly represent everything about Dark Souls as a franchise. Even the music captures every moment of the fight, whether it be the intensity of it, the rage of the Dark Soul, or the sorrow of Gale's quest and the ruin it brought him. I will never forget Gale as a character, and I will always cite him as the platinum standard for bosses in video games, and a true testament to the artistry that video games as a medium are capable of. Dark Souls push the boundaries in many ways, but nowhere in the series is this more seen than in this final battle with this old knight. And with that, the list has come to an end. I had a lot of fun making this video and going through this whole series in detail. Dark Souls is my favourite game franchise, and I definitely want to make more walkthroughs and boss rankings of other From Software games as well. Last year I played Sekiro for the first time, and it was just as amazing as peak Dark Souls with some insane boss fights to boot. Hopefully soon enough I'll have a walkthrough for Sekiro Began, and I can't wait to make more videos again. It's been a while and I'd forgotten how much I love making videos. Hopefully this year can see a real revival for this old channel. But until then, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.